Imagine yourself in a quiet medieval town, long after the clamor of the day has faded. The sounds of merchants calling out their wares and the footsteps of townsfolk on the cobblestone streets have drifted into memory, leaving behind only the hush of evening. Lanterns hang from iron hooks along timber-framed houses, their soft flames bending in the breeze and casting pale circles of light upon the damp stones below. The night air is cool, with a faint scent of earth after rain, mingled with the fragrance of herbs drying in cottage kitchens. Somewhere nearby, a narrow river slides past the town walls, the water catching the glow of the moon as it murmurs over wooden pilings and slips beneath a low bridge. You may hear the rustle of reeds and the distant call of a nightbird, though the greater sound is silence, the kind of silence that draws the mind into rest. In this stillness, the world of knights drifts into view, but not the knights of battlefields and banners whose names filled the great chronicles of war. Tonight we will walk instead through the gentler paths of memory, where another kind of knight lived. These were men who bore the title, who trained with sword and shield, yet never rode into bloody campaigns. Their days were not defined by the clash of steel but by the softer rhythms of life, overseeing small estates, tending horses that never galloped in war, or keeping prayer in quiet chapels. They stood at the edges of history, often unnamed, their lives woven not with triumphs and defeats, but with patience, care, and continuity. Picture one such night rising at dawn. The bells of a chapel ring faintly across the mist, and he steps out into the cool morning air. Dew clings to the grass, shining like beads of glass, while the fields stretch beyond the manor house in muted green. His armor hangs untouched in the armory, polished yet unused, catching only the flicker of firelight when the door opens. Instead of battle drills, his tasks turn toward the land, speaking with villagers about harvests, checking fences where sheep graze, and walking along riverbanks to be sure that mills and bridges remain strong. His strength is spent not in combat, but in the patient guardianship of daily life. There is a kind of beauty in this forgotten role. For while history remembers wars and conquests, it is the quiet caretakers who preserved stability in the spaces between conflict. Their estates provided bread, their chapels held prayers, their presence reassured villagers who feared raids or unrest. They carried swords by custom, yet their truest weapons were steadiness, courtesy, and restraint. And though their names rarely appear in chronicles, their lives shaped the world in ways that endure, hidden like roots beneath the soil. Imagine now the hearth at dusk, where such a night returns after a day of small duties. The fire glows steadily in the hall, its light dancing against stone walls. A loaf of bread rests cooling on the table, its crust browned and fragrant. A servant carries in a pot of stew, thick with lentils and vegetables from the garden, while a flagon of ale stands ready beside wooden cups. The knight sits among his household, not as a commander of armies, but as a figure of calm presence. Conversation drifts easily, perhaps about the weather, perhaps about the yield of orchards, or simply about the song a minstrel carried into town the week before. These are not the grand tales sung by poets, but they are the true rhythm of life, rhythm that allows peace to continue unbroken. When the meal ends, he may walk through the courtyard to the stables. Horses nicker softly as he passes, their breath rising in small clouds in the evening chill. He strokes their necks, checks the feed, and listens to the slow crunch of hay beneath their teeth. These animals were bred for speed and strength, yet here they find a gentler service carrying him along country lanes, to markets and chapels, or perhaps to visit a neighboring manor. Their hooves do not thunder in charge, but tread quietly. On familiar earth, the knight too finds companionship in their presence, a steady bond between man and creature that asks for no battlefield to prove its worth. As night deepens, the chapel beckons once more. Candles glow in iron holders, lighting the small stone space with a warm and golden hush. The knight kneels on a wooden bench, the echo of his whispered prayer rising softly beneath the vaulted ceiling. Here, the air smells faintly of beeswax and incense. Outside, the fields lie in shadow, and the town sleeps. But within the chapel there is a sense of timelessness. His vows were not wasted because they were never tested in war. Instead, they found their truth in patience, humility, and faith. These are the lives we will explore tonight, knights, without battles not only made of noise and spectacle, but also of stillness. For every warrior who rode into combat, there were others who remained, holding together the fabric of daily existence. They may not have carved their names into monuments, yet they shape the living world through constancy and care. As you listen, allow yourself to drift with them into the gentle cadence of their days. Imagine the cool touch of stone walls beneath your hand, the smell of hay and herbs, the flicker of lamplight on polished wood. Imagine the sound of distant bells, marking hours not of urgency, but of quiet routine. These images, like threads of a tapestry, weave slowly together until the picture is whole, a picture not of conquest, but of peace preserved in small acts. So let the world outside your room fall silent. Set aside the weight of your day, and enter this other time where life moved more slowly. Tonight, you need not follow warriors into danger, nor hear the clash of swords. Instead, you will walk beside the knights who never went to war, whose gift to history was the calm of continuity. Their presence will guide you toward rest, like lanterns glowing faintly on a misty street, or the hush of river water moving beneath a wooden bridge. In this calm company, may you find the ease of sleep. The morning begins softly, with the world wrapped in mist. A pale haze lingers across the meadows, and the dew on the grass glitters faintly in the first light of dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a chapel bell tolls once, its slow, resonant note, carrying far across the valley. The sound is not urgent, not hurried, but patient, like the steady heartbeat of the land itself. In a small stone building, cool and still, a single candle flickers before an altar. Its glow catches the edge of polished armor resting against a wall, gleaming in the dim light. A man kneels, his head bowed, hands clasped, whispering a vow that will guide his life. He is a knight, but not the kind we imagine from painted chronicles or tales of battle. He is not preparing for war, nor does he dream of glory in tournaments. Instead, his oath binds him to a quieter duty, to guard, to pray, to oversee, to preserve. Knighthood, in its earliest meaning, was a broad and varied calling. Some men bore the title yet never crossed swords in combat. Their service was sworn, in chapels, in the shadow of monasteries, or in the timber halls of small lords whose domains stretched no further than a few villages and fields. These oaths, spoken in solemn tones, were promises of loyalty, guardianship, and order. They were not always tied to conquest, but often to the preservation of peace. Imagine the hush of such a moment, the stone walls echoing with words softly uttered, the watching eyes of priests or elders, the smell of wax and incense filling the air. The knight would place his hands on holy texts or upon the hilt of a sword, not to raise it in battle, but to hold it as a symbol of service and restraint. The days that followed such vows unfolded in a rhythm of calm. At first light, the knight might walk across the manor courtyard, his breath visible in the cool air, his cloak drawn against the chill. Horses stirred in their stables, snorting softly as servants brought hay and water. Beyond the walls, the fields stretched into pale morning, dotted with workers beginning their labors. He would pause to watch them, perhaps offering a word of encouragement or instruction, not with the commanding voice of a war leader, but with the steady tone of a steward ensuring that life continued without disruption. His role was to keep the peace, to see that boundaries were respected, that disputes were settled before they grew, that the rhythm of the land endured. At midday, the great hall would fill with the sounds of daily life. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, its crackle providing warmth and comfort. The table was spread with bread, thick and coarse, but fresh from the oven, its crust warm beneath the hand. Cheese, hard and salted, was cut into wedges. A pot of stew simmered over the flames, filled with beans and vegetables gathered from the estate gardens. There was no feasting of roasted boar or extravagant displays of wealth, but a quiet meal, shared among household members. The knight sat not in solitary grandeur, but surrounded by retainers, family, and servants, speaking of weather, of crops, of the small happenings of the estate. These conversations were not written in chronicles, but they formed the true substance of life. Afternoons often drew him to the chapel again. The air inside was cool, smelling of stone and faint incense. Light streamed through narrow windows, falling in sharp bands across the floor. Here, the knight knelt, sometimes in solitude, sometimes with others, reciting prayers that steadied the heart and grounded the spirit. The echoes of words in that small space, whispered beneath vaulted ceilings, became a daily act of devotion. His sword might rest beside him, untouched, polished but unused. Its presence was not a reminder of violence, but of readiness, a symbol of strength, held in reserve. To pray in armor that would never see war was, in a way, an act of profound peace. It meant the weapon had been transformed from an instrument of bloodshed into a symbol of duty and vigilance. Evenings arrived slowly. The sun set behind rolling hills, painting the sky with soft bands of gold and violet. In the courtyard, the knight might walk once more, his steps quiet against the flagstones. Horses shifted in their stalls, the sound of hoofs against wood rhythmic and soothing. Dogs settled near the hearth, their ears twitching at distant sounds. Inside, the hall glowed warmly with lamplight. A minstrel might pluck a gentle tune on a lute, or perhaps a servant hummed while clearing the tables. These sounds were not grand, not remarkable, but they carried the peace of continuity. The knight, seated with a cup of ale, would watch the fire burn low, feeling the weight of another day lived without strife. Knighthood was often associated with grand tales, chivalric romances of dragons, battles, and quests, but for many, reality was far quieter. The oath did not always call them to danger. Instead, it bound them to serve through patience, to ensure that the barns were filled with grain, that the villagers could work without fear, that justice was tempered with fairness. Their honor lay not in the clash of steel, but in the preservation of daily life. And though such stories seldom reached the ears of poets or scribes, they were no less noble for being unsung. It is easy to overlook these knights, to think them insignificant because they left no scars upon the battlefield, but their presence was essential. They were the still centers of a world often thrown into turmoil, while others marched to distant wars. These knights remained, tending, preserving, holding steady the fragile balance of their communities. Their oaths echoed not in war cries, but in the laughter of children playing by village wells, in the quiet prayers offered in chapels, in the steady rhythm of horses pulling plows through fields. Their strength was not measured by conquest, but by continuity. When night finally descended, and the manor fell into stillness, the knight would retire to his chamber. The air was cool, the only light, a flickering candle at the bedside. His armor stood nearby, gleaming faintly in the shadows, polished carefully though never tested in combat. He lay down upon a simple bed, the sounds of the night drifting in, the whisper of wind through cracks in the shutters, the murmur of the river beyond the walls, the occasional call of an owl. In that silence, his oath remained with him, not a burden, but a quiet presence, like the steady glow of an ember that never burned out. Thus ended another day in the life of a knight who never went to war. And though no songs were sung of him, though no chronicles etched his name into memory, his legacy was written in the calm he preserved. His oath, spoken once in a stone chapel, beneath the flicker of candlelight, shaped not only his life but the lives of those around him. It was an oath not of violence but of care, not of conquest but of patience, and in its gentleness it found a nobility all its own. The morning arrived slowly in the countryside, with a pale sky opening above the quiet earth. The first sounds of the day are not those of clashing steel or war horns, but of small, familiar voices of the land itself. A rooster calls from a thatched farmyard, its sharp cry breaking through the mist that lies heavy over the meadows. Bells ring in the distance, their tones low and steady, marking the rhythm of life for all who hear them. In these soft hours of dawn, a knight wakes, not to mount a charger for battle, but to step into the calm responsibilities of land and stewardship. His chamber is modest, with a single wooden chest, a small bed covered with woolen blankets, and a narrow window through which pale beams of sunlight filter, illuminating motes of dust that drift lazily in the air. Beside the bed, his sword rests quietly against the wall, polished but unused, more a token of rank than a tool of war. He rises, washes his face in a basin of cool water drawn the night before, and prepares himself for another day of quiet service. The courtyard is already alive when he steps outside. Stable boys carry buckets of water to waiting horses, whose breath steams in the morning chill. Chickens scurry across the stones, pecking at grains scattered by a kitchen servant. The smell of baking bread drifts from the manor ovens, carrying with it the warmth of promise that soon the hall will be filled with simple food to break the fast. Yet before he eats, the knight often chooses to walk the edges of the estate. Wrapped in a cloak against the cool air, he moves slowly across the damp grass, boots leaving faint marks that quickly fade as the sun climbs. This walk is not a march but a vigil, a way of seeing and knowing the land entrusted to him. He pauses at hedges to check the weaving of branches, ensuring that sheep will not wander into barley fields. He inspects wooden fences, worn from rain and wind, running his hand across their surfaces, making mental notes of where repairs will be needed. Sometimes he stops near a plot of tilled earth, crouching to run soil between his fingers, feeling its dampness, judging whether the season will be kind to wheat or oats. His mornings are not hurried, they are deliberate, rooted in care rather than conquest. The fields stretch wide and gentle, green and gold depending on the time of year, carrying the promise of harvest in their quiet rows. Dew lies thick upon the blades of grass, glistening like silver. These sights are as familiar as the patterns of his own hand. He has walked them so many times that every slope, every curve of meadow, every copse of trees has become part of his memory. The land is not merely property, but companion, and in its quiet presence, he finds a kind of peace that no battlefield could provide. The morning light itself feels like a fellow guardian, shining gently across the village, over cottages with smoke drifting from their chimneys, over workers already bending to their tasks with hoes and sickles. There is dignity in these scenes, though it is a dignity that seldom makes its way into chronicles. The peasants, too, notice his presence. As he walks along the boundary of a field, a woman bent over with a basket of vegetables looks up, nodding politely before returning to her work. Children gathering firewood near the hedges pause to watch him, their eyes curious but unafraid. They know this figure, not as a warrior to be feared, but as a steady protector who ensures that their daily labors remain undisturbed by raiders or disputes. The knight may stop to exchange a few words with a tenant farmer, speaking softly of weather and soil, listening more than commanding, showing interest in the small rhythms that shape their lives. In these simple exchanges, his authority is expressed not through force but through presence, a reminder that his role is to keep order, to maintain peace, to act as a bridge between the quiet world of labor and the broader structures of lordship. When the sun rises higher, warming the earth and clearing the last of the mist, the knight returns to the manor hall for breakfast. The table is simple, laid with bread, cheese, and a bowl of porridge made from oats grown on the very fields he has just walked. A jug of watered ale is passed around, and sometimes fresh milk from the manor cows. The meal is taken without ceremony, but it is filling, and in each bite there is the reminder of the bond between the land and those who serve it. The knight eats slowly, his mind often still turned toward the tasks that lie ahead. He thinks of broken fences, of barns that need patching, of the coming harvest that must be gathered and stored. These are not the concerns of a soldier but of a steward, yet they carry a weight just as heavy, for in ensuring the health of these fields, he secures the life of the community, the safety of those who look to him for guidance and protection. After breakfast, he sometimes turns to the stables, checking the condition of horses. They are strong animals, not bred only for charging into battle, but for pulling carts, carrying loads, and traveling steadily across long distances. He runs his hand down their flanks, feeling the warmth of living strength beneath. He checks the leather of saddles and harnesses, making sure they are not worn or frayed. Care is given not only to the animals, but to the tools of daily life. Plows sharpened, carts repaired, ropes coiled and stored. Each detail, though small, forms part of the greater web of responsibility that the knight carries. The village itself awakens fully as morning turns to midday. Smoke rises from cottage chimneys, and the sounds of work carry through the air. Axes splitting wood, scythes swishing through grass, hammers striking nails into timber. The knight may walk among these cottages, speaking with elders, listening to concerns, a dispute over land boundaries, a question about grazing rights, a worry about a sick cow's matters. Though simple, require judgment and fairness. He listens carefully, weighing each side, offering solutions that preserve harmony. His presence in these affairs is not dramatic, but it is vital. Without such mediation, quarrels could grow, spreading bitterness that weakens the bonds of community. His role is to keep peace, not by sword, but by patience. The day continues with these steady rhythms, but it is the morning light, the first hours of the day, that hold a special calm. In those moments when the fields glisten with dew and the mist lifts slowly into the sky, the knight feels the essence of his duty most strongly. He is not called to charge into chaos, but to stand watch over order. His mornings are not marked by urgency, but by quiet vigilance, and in this gentleness lies his strength. The fields, the fences, the barns, the cottages, the people all are held together by the simple, enduring presence of one who has sworn an oath to guard them. As noon approaches and the sun shines brightly across the meadows, the tasks of the morning draw to a close. Workers rest briefly, sitting beneath trees, eating bread and onions carried in cloth bundles. The night, too, finds shade, sometimes beneath the very oak trees that have stood watch over these lands for centuries. He looks out across the fields, seeing not just crops, but the unfolding of countless lives that depend upon their growth. He knows that in tending to these quiet duties, he is shaping the future as surely as any warrior shaping history on a battlefield. His legacy is not written in blood, but in barley, in wheat, in the steady turning of the seasons. And as the morning fades into afternoon, the light across the fields becomes softer, carrying with it the quiet satisfaction of a duty fulfilled without conflict, a service rendered in peace. Thus, in every dawn that broke over these quiet lands, the life of a knight who never went to war unfolded with calm dignity. Each step across dew-covered meadows, each careful inspection of fences and fields, each gentle exchange with workers and villagers was part of a greater oath, an oath to guard not through violence but through care. The morning light itself seemed to bless this life, casting its glow upon armor that seldom left the hall, upon hands that carried tools as often as swords, upon faces that smiled with trust rather than fear. And though history rarely remembers these nights, their mornings left an imprint as lasting as any battle. Their strength was written not in victories but in the quiet survival of fields, families, and the soft rhythm of days that began always with the crow of a rooster, the toll of a bell, and the mist rising gently from the earth. Midday in a knight's household was not a time for grand feasts or roaring banquets, as so many legends might suggest, but rather for steady nourishment and quiet companionship. As the sun climbed high in the sky, the fields outside the manor glowed with light, and the air carried the scents of earth, hay, and the faint sweetness of herbs from the kitchen gardens. Within the manor itself, the heart of the household pulsed gently at the hearth, where fires smoldered and pots simmered. Here, far from the clamor of imagined battles, life unfolded with warmth, patience, and care. The knight, who spent his morning walking boundaries and checking fields, would return by this hour, not to dan his armor, but to sit at a long wooden table surrounded by retainers, servants, and sometimes visiting tenants. The scene was marked not by ceremony but by simplicity, for midday was a time of pause, of drawing strength from food and fellowship before the afternoon tasks resumed. The meal began with bread, the most essential food of medieval life. Loaves were pulled fresh from clay ovens that had been heating since dawn, their crusts browned and cracked, their interiors soft and steaming. The smell of baking bread filled the hall, wrapping the room in comfort. Each person received a portion, torn by hand and shared, often dipped into stews that had been bubbling slowly since morning. These stews were thick with lentils, onions, carrots, and sometimes a small cut of meat or bones that lent flavor to the broth. The knight, though higher in rank, ate nearly the same as those around him. The difference lay not in the food itself, but in the quantity and in the place he occupied. At the table's head, a symbolic reminder of his role as guardian of the estate, cheese often accompanied the bread and stew. Wheels of hard cheese, aged in cool storerooms, were cut into wedges and passed around. Sometimes fresh, soft cheese made from the morning's milk was spread onto slices of bread, its tang sharp against the sweetness of grain. On days when fish was available, often caught in nearby rivers or ponds stocked for just this purpose, it was boiled or fried in pans over the fire. Herbs gathered from the manor's gardens, sage, parsley, or thyme added subtle flavor, a small luxury that brought brightness to otherwise plain fare. Nothing was wasted. Bones from meat were boiled to create broth. Onion skins were dried and used for dye. Even stale bread, once too hard to eat alone, was crumbled into stews or softened with warm milk. The rhythm of the kitchen was one of resourcefulness, making the most of what the land offered. As the meal unfolded, the hall filled with the gentle clatter of spoons and wooden trenchers. Conversation drifted in low tones, punctuated by the occasional laugh or sigh. The knight might listen to reports from his steward about the state of barns or the progress of repairs on a fence. He might exchange stories with a retainer about their families or hear the worries of a farmer who had come to dine that day. But much of the time, The atmosphere was unhurried. People ate slowly, savoring the comfort of warmth and nourishment. For many, the hearth's glow was as important as the food itself. The fire, kept alive from morning to night, radiated a steady warmth that softened the chill of stone walls. Its crackle provided a rhythm that seemed to set the pace of life within the hall. The hearth was more than a place for cooking, it was the soul of the household. Its smoke curled upward through the rafters, carrying with it the scents of wood and spice. Pots hung on iron hooks above the flames, bubbling softly. A cauldron might simmer with soup, while flat stones near the embers warmed loaves of bread or small cakes. Around it, servants bustled, tending to the fire, stirring pots and slicing vegetables. Children sometimes lingered nearby, their eyes wide with anticipation for the moment when they too would be handed a bowl of steaming stew. Even animals occasionally crept close to household dogs lying at the edge of the warmth, their tails thumping softly against the floor as scraps were tossed their way. For the knight, sitting at the head of the table with the fire at his side, this moment of midday rest was both practical and symbolic. His armor often hung on pegs nearby, polished but unused, a reminder of his station, yet also of the peace that defined his life. In its place, the fire itself became the true shield of the household. It defended not with force but with constancy, providing heat for food, light for vision, and comfort for the spirit. While the outside world might hold threats, within these walls the hearth cast a circle of safety. The conversations at midday were gentle and grounded in the ordinary. Tenants might ask about when the next tithe would be collected, or if they might borrow a plough from the manor. Servants might laugh about small mishaps in the kitchen, like spilled flour or a burned loaf. Retainers might recall stories from their youth, tales of festivals, of old masters, of distant relatives rarely seen. Sometimes the knight himself would tell a story, though not of battles, but of childhood memories, of lessons learned in the company of elders, or of journeys made through forests and fields. These stories were not meant to stir excitement, but to pass time peacefully, to share bonds through memory and voice. The hall itself carried a quiet majesty. Though simple by modern eyes, its long beams of oak, its stone hearth, and its high ceiling gave it a sense of endurance. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, illuminating the worn surfaces of benches and tables. Tapestries hung on the walls, not ornate but functional, adding insulation against the cold. The smell of smoke and herbs lingered in the air, mingling with the scent of fresh bread. For those gathered within, this space was a world of its own, removed from the wider uncertainties of the age. Here, at midday, the knight's role was not to command, but to share, to embody stability through his presence. Once the meal was finished, the hall did not immediately return to work. People lingered, resting in the warmth, speaking softly, or simply closing their eyes for a moment of stillness. The knight might sit back in his chair, hands folded loosely, gazing into the flames. He thought not of battles but of weather, of harvests, of whether the river would flood come spring. The fire's light danced across his armor, casting shadows that shifted like passing clouds. To him, this pause was as necessary as any duty, for in these moments of rest, the household regained its strength. The afternoon would bring more tasks, but midday was its own ritual, a time of gathering, of nourishment, of quiet communion. The fire that had cooked the meal would continue to burn, tended carefully so it never died. Ashes would be pushed aside, embers banked, new logs laid gently to catch the flame. This fire was a thread running through every day, connecting dawn to dusk, winter to summer, year to year. Just as the knight's oath bound him to serve, the hearth bound the household to life. In this way, the rhythm of midday in a knight's hall was not one of noise or spectacle, but of gentle continuity. Bread was broken, stews were shared, stories were told, and warmth was given. It was a time when armor remained untouched, when the clatter of spoons replaced the clash of swords, and when the glow of the hearth became the true emblem of strength. Though history's chronicles seldom record these hours, they shaped the daily existence of countless knights who never went to war. Their lives were not defined by conquest but by care, not by violence but by the quiet dignity of a meal shared at the heart of a household. And so, each day, as the sun reached its peak, the knight returned to the same place, to the same table, to the same fire. In that steady ritual lay the true rhythm of his life, rhythm not remembered in legend but deeply felt in the simple comfort of bread, cheese, stew, and the crackle of a hearth that never ceased to burn. The afternoon light often streamed softly through narrow windows of stone halls, falling across long wooden tables where young boys, known as pages, moved carefully under the watchful eyes of their masters. These boys were not yet squires, not yet on the path to knighthood in its fuller form, but they had already left the warmth of their family hearths to enter the service of a knight. In many households, the knights themselves were not men of war but men of discipline, stewards of land, and guardians of order. For them, the training of a page was less about preparing for the clash of swords and more about shaping character through patience, courtesy, and knowledge. Thus, the lessons a page received in such households were calm, steady, and rooted in the rhythms of daily life rather than the chaos of campaigns. A page might begin his duties early in the morning, carrying water to the knight's chamber, polishing boots, or helping prepare the hall for meals. These small acts were themselves lessons. They taught humility, respect, and care for details. A knight who had never gone to war still expected his page to notice how a table was set, how a cloak was folded, or how a letter was carried from one room to another. Courtesy was not decoration but structure, a way of living that ordered the household and gave dignity to every gesture. Pages learned to bow at the right time, to speak softly but clearly, to serve food with steady hands. Each motion, repeated daily, carried with it a kind of discipline that formed the foundation of adulthood. Yet beyond the duties of service, the knights who guided these boys understood the importance of knowledge. In many halls, parchment and ink were as valuable as armor and steel. A knight who did not ride into battle often had time to read letters, to keep accounts, and to manage estates. He might open a chest containing documents, rent rolls, charters, or letters from a local monastery and place them on a table where the page could see. With patience, he guided the boy's hand as it traced letters, first awkwardly, then with greater steadiness. Candlelight flickered across the parchment as the child's brow furrowed in concentration. Mistakes were gently corrected, not with anger but with calm explanation. These were moments of deep learning, where strength was measured not in muscle but in the steady formation of thought and memory. Outside, the world of the village continued its rhythm. Oxen plowed the fields, women spun wool into thread, and children gathered kindling from the forest edges. But within the hall, a quieter world unfolded. The knight would sometimes pause in his reading to tell the page stories not of battles, but of saints, of wise kings, of travelers who crossed mountains and seas. These tales were chosen not to stir adventure, but to plant lessons: the value of honesty, the danger of pride, the reward of patience. The boy listened, wide-eyed, committing these words to memory. For in an age when books were rare and costly, much learning passed through voice and ear. From master to servant, from elder to youth, training with weapons was not absent, but it was tempered by calmness. A wooden practice sword might be handed to the boy, not with the expectation that he would master the art of combat, but that he would learn balance, focus, and restraint. The knight might stand nearby, correcting the grip, adjusting the stance, encouraging the page to move slowly, to feel the weight of the wood, to notice how the body shifted with each motion. There was no urgency, no demand for speed or aggression. The sword was set aside often, replaced by lessons in reading, writing, or arithmetic, reminding the boy that strength was not only in the arm but in the mind. The afternoons were long, and lessons often took place in the quiet hours when the sun warmed the stones and shadows stretched across the floor. The page might carry inkpots, careful not to spill a drop, or grind pigments for simple illuminations, learning how patience shaped beauty. He might help tally grain stores, counting sacks in the storeroom, guided by the knight's voice as numbers were spoken aloud. Through such tasks, he learned that estates were not held by force of arms alone, but by careful stewardship, by watching over every detail of field and barn, of tenant and servant. Even meals became lessons. The page, serving at table, learned not only how to pour ale without spilling, but also how to listen. At midday, as we saw before, the hall was filled with the murmurs of conversation. The knight might speak of harvests, of disputes among villagers, of repairs to be made. The boy listened, absorbing the rhythm of governance, hearing how a leader spoke, not in commands but in measured tones, balancing fairness with firmness. Later, in private, the knight might explain why one decision was made over another, why a soft word sometimes carried more strength than a loud one. These were gentle lessons, learned not in the field of battle but in the hearthlit hall. The bond between knight and page was not forged in danger but in shared time. When the day's duties were done, the boy might sit at the knight's feet, mending a strap or polishing a piece of armor, while the older man reflected aloud on the nature of honor, of faith, of patience. The armor itself, gleaming though seldom used, became a symbol in these lessons, not of conquest but of responsibility. It is not only for fighting, the knight might say softly, but for showing that we are ready to bear the burdens given to us. The page, nodding, understood that his training was not about victory in war, but about readiness in life. Seasons turned, and the lessons shifted with them. In summer, the page followed the knight into fields, learning how to judge crops, how to store hay, how to keep tools sharp. In autumn, he watched as grain was measured and stored, seeing how fairness ensured loyalty among peasants. In winter, he learned to keep fires banked, to mend cloaks, to read by dim light when days were short. Each season brought its own rhythm, and the knight used each to teach patience, observation, and steadiness. The boy grew not only in height but in understanding, his mind shaped by the gentle insistence of lessons that valued constancy over spectacle. The soundscape of these lessons was itself calming, the scratching of quills on parchment, the bubbling of stew in the hearth cauldron, the occasional bark of a dog outside, the cooing of pigeons in the rafters. These were the sounds that surrounded a page. They were not dramatic, but they formed a world that was whole, where learning was steady and life was framed by small, repeated rituals. The boy's hand grew surer in writing. His speech became measured, his movements became graceful. All these changes were slow, almost imperceptible, but they accumulated, just as drops of water slowly shape stone. Evenings often closed these lessons. As the sun set and candles were lit, the knight might invite the page to read aloud from a psalter or a book of hours. The boy stumbled over words at first, but with gentle correction, he improved. Candlelight flickered on the parchment, on the boy's earnest face, on the knight's calm expression. The day ended, not with shouting or exhaustion, but with quiet progress, with the sense that patience itself was the greatest teacher. When the page finally retired to his bed in a small chamber, he carried with him the sounds of the knight's voice, the warmth of the fire, and the steady knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same. In this way, the pages who trained under knights who never went to war received an education often overlooked by chroniclers of battles. They learned not the thrill of combat but the deeper strength of courtesy, discipline, and stewardship. Their lives were shaped by lessons that reached beyond the sword, into the realms of governance, literacy, and patience. And though their names may not echo in history's grand tales, the communities they later guided, the families they raised, and the lands they tended bore the quiet imprint of these gentle teachings. The image of a young page leaning over parchment, tracing letters by candlelight while a knight looked on, is perhaps one of the most enduring pictures of this forgotten life. It speaks of continuity, of knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. It reminds us that history was not only written by those who fought, but also by those who taught, who guided, who prepared others for lives of steadiness and service. For every battle remembered in chronicles, there were countless afternoons of study, of soft correction, of learning how to serve with dignity. And so, the hall that afternoon glowed, not with the clash of arms, but with the steady hum of lessons. Pages moved quietly, knights spoke gently, and life unfolded in rhythms that shaped souls more deeply than war ever could. These were the gentle lessons of pages, the slow shaping of character beneath the watchful eyes of knights, whose greatest victories were not won on distant fields, but in the quiet transformation of young lives at home. The sound of bells was one of the most constant threads in the life of a medieval knight who never rode to war, where others might have been stirred by the trumpet's call to arms. These men were guided instead by the gentle tolling of iron or bronze across the fields, valleys, and forests of their homeland. The bells marked the hours not with urgency, but with rhythm, calling people to prayer, reminding them of devotion, and steadying the passage of time. A knight who tied his life to a chapel rather than a battlefield ordered his days by those sounds, morning, noon, and evening, each toll echoing like a reminder that life's true victories lay not in conquest, but in service and contemplation. In the early hours, when dew still clung to the meadows and mist drifted low across rivers, the first bell would sound. It was not loud, not triumphant, but soft and carrying, its notes weaving through trees and over farmlands. The knight, rising from his bed in a modest chamber, would often pause to listen before he moved. That sound called him toward the chapel, a small building of stone with wooden beams, its walls sometimes covered with ivy or moss. Entering, he might kneel before the altar, the cool air of the place wrapping around him, the faint scent of beeswax and old wood filling his breath. These vigils were not hurried. They were moments of quiet, offering words whispered in Latin or in the plain speech of his homeland. Prayers for health, for peace, for the well-being of his tenants and family. The chapel itself was a world of symbols. The stained glass, when sunlight touched it, filled the space with colors that shifted slowly across the flagstone floor. Red, blue, gold, and green, as if the heavens themselves had spilled into the small room. Candles burned in niches, their flames steady even in drafts, each one a quiet echo of the eternal. The knight's sword, if present at all, leaned unused against the wall. Instead of being lifted in battle, it stood as a symbol of readiness to defend faith, not to conquer others. Many such knights saw their role not as aggressors, but as guardians, protectors of holy spaces, keepers of order, stewards of land, so that worship could continue unbroken. The work of devotion extended beyond kneeling at prayer. These knights often took part in the physical care of the chapels themselves. Stones had to be cleaned of moss, wooden doors repaired, pathways cleared, so that pilgrims might find their way safely. A knight who once might have been trained in the arts of warfare now used the same discipline to mend roofs, to plant flowers in gardens, or to carry water to the baptistry. His hands, which might have been hardened by sword practice, instead became accustomed to carrying tools of repair: hammers, spades, or simple knives used for trimming vines. The act of tending the chapel was itself a form of prayer, a physical devotion made visible in the preservation of beauty and shelter. Midday bells brought another rhythm. As their sound stretched across the countryside, villagers, peasants, and travelers paused in their work, turning their hearts and minds to prayer. The knight, often seated at the side of the chapel or walking through nearby fields, would bow his head with them. At times, pilgrims appeared, weary from long journeys, their clothes dust-covered, their steps slow with exhaustion. These travelers found rest at the knight's door. Bread was given, simple water offered, sometimes a place to sit by the hearth or to sleep in a sheltered barn. No grand feast was necessary, for kindness itself was the feast, a gesture of welcome that refreshed weary souls more than meat or wine could. Many pilgrims remembered such nights not for their armor, which remained untouched, but for their open hands and soft words. To enter such a hall was to step into quietness, where the fire burned steadily, where meals were modest but filling, where the knight himself might serve rather than be served. Some even joined the pilgrims in prayer before sending them on their way, pressing a small token into their palms, a carved cross, a sprig of herbs, a scrap of parchment with a blessing written in careful letters. These gifts were not costly, but they carried meaning, reminders that the journey of faith was shared by many, supported by kindness along the road. Evening bells were perhaps the most haunting. As the sun set and shadows lengthened across fields, the sound rose into the darkening air, reminding all who heard it that the day was closing, that another measure of time had passed. For the knight, these bells were a call not only to prayer but to reflection. Sitting within the chapel or outside on a stone bench, he might gaze upward, watching the stars emerge one by one. Thoughts turned inward. The fragility of life, the needs of the people under his care, the mystery of the divine. In these hours, the world seemed hushed, the noise of work faded, the village quiet, leaving space for stillness. The presence of bells in daily life cannot be overstated. They were timekeepers in an age when clocks were rare. They marked devotion in an age when faith wove through every moment. For a knight devoted to the chapel, bells shaped not only his schedule but his very heart. Their tones reminded him that life was not measured in victories or defeats, but in prayers spoken, kindness offered, duties fulfilled with care. He lived not for fame but for constancy, his days bound together by the steady ringing that crossed woodlands and valleys, uniting shepherds, farmers, monks, and lords alike in a shared rhythm of devotion. Inside the chapel, seasons passed with their own rituals. Advent candles burned in winter, their light piercing the darkest nights. Easter brought fresh flowers strewn across the altar, symbols of renewal and life. Summer saw the doors thrown open, sunlight pouring in, bees buzzing near the gardens outside. Autumn brought harvest offerings, wheat, apples, grapes placed before the altar as gifts of gratitude. Each season was a chapter of devotion, and the knight moved through them steadily. His life aligned not with campaigns, but with liturgy, not with conquest, but with prayer. Sometimes he was joined by villagers who sought counsel, a widow grieving, a farmer worried about crops, a child curious about the world. Each found a listening ear. The knight, shaped by hours of reflection, responded with gentleness, offering encouragement, advice, or simply the gift of presence. He was not a priest, but his devotion gave him a kind of wisdom that others trusted. His chapel became a place not only of ritual but of community, where burdens were shared and where even silence could be comforting. The legacy of such knights is harder to trace in chronicles, for their deeds were not carved into stone or sung by minstrels, yet their presence was deeply felt by those around them. Communities held together not only by power but by compassion, not only by law but by faith. The bells they tended, the chapels they maintained, the kindness they offered to strangers, all of these left ripples in time, unseen yet enduring. Their days, though quiet, were not empty. They were filled with service that shaped lives and gave strength to villagers, farms, and travelers who carried those memories onward. Thus, the chapel bells were not just sounds in the distance. They were heartbeats of a world where knights found meaning in stillness rather than struggle. Their rhythm wove through morning, noon, and evening, guiding lives toward patience, devotion, and kindness. And though the clash of swords and the roar of battle often filled the grand pages of history, the gentler toll of bells continued unseen, shaping another kind of legacy, the quiet triumph of faith lived out in ordinary days. The image of the medieval knight is almost always tied to the figure of a horse. We imagine powerful steeds clad in shining armor, charging into the fray of battle, hooves thundering against the earth, banners streaming behind them. Yet for many knights who never saw combat, the horse was not a companion of war, but of life itself. These animals carried them not onto bloody fields but along quiet forest tracks, down narrow lanes between hedgerows, or across the open expanse of farmland, where barley and wheat swayed gently in the wind. Their hooves left no marks of conquest, only the soft imprint of daily journeys, and hurried, steady, and familiar. The knight without war still found in his horse a partner, a friend, and a reflection of his own discipline. Every morning began with the low sounds of the stable. Before the world had fully woken, the knight or his attendants would step into the dim interior of a timber-framed barn, where the air smelled of hay, leather, and the warm presence of animals at rest. Horses shifted in their stalls, their breath rising like mist in the cool dawn. A soft nicker, the stamping of a hoof, the gentle swish of a tail, these sounds filled the space more than any trumpet or drum ever could. The knight would move, slowly, speaking in low tones, laying a hand against a broad neck, feeling the quiet power of muscle beneath sleek skin. Before prayers, before meals, there was often this moment of tending, checking water troughs, scattering fresh hay, and brushing coats until they gleamed when the first light of day crept through the stable doors. The care of horses was as much ritual as it was necessity. Their manes were combed, their hooves picked clean of stones and mud, their saddles and bridles inspected for wear. To brush a horse was to share time with it, to listen to the steady breath, to notice the twitch of ears, the blink of eyes, the subtle language of trust. For knights who never tested their steeds on battlefields, these animals became symbols of constancy. They did not need to charge into danger to prove their worth. Instead, their loyalty was shown in every step along familiar paths, in the way they carried their rider from village to chapel, from fields to manor, from sunrise to sunset. When the knight mounted in the morning, the ride was rarely swift. He might guide his horse along the edges of farmland, pausing to greet peasants at work. Farmers bent over their plows would straighten and nod respectfully as the pair passed, their faces touched by the glow of the early sun. The knight might stop to exchange a few words, asking after crops, weather, or family. His horse would stand patiently, ears flicking at the buzz of flies, tail swishing slowly, a silent companion to the conversation. These journeys were not heroic in the traditional sense, but they held a quiet heroism of presence, of showing care through simple constancy. At times, the knight's horse became a link between scattered places. Villagers depended on these mounted figures not for protection from invading armies, but for the steady delivery of messages, oversight of land, or the transport of supplies. A basket of bread tied behind the saddle, a small chest of herbs carried in a satchel, or even a pilgrim riding double. Behind such were the images of travel. The horse, trained for obedience and strength, accepted these tasks without complaint, its steady gait carrying life's necessities across distances. Afternoons in the stable yard were filled with quieter labors. Harnesses hung neatly from pegs, their leather softened with oil. Saddle blankets were shaken free of dust, laid out in the sun to air. Buckets of water were carried and poured, splashing, cool and clear into troughs. The horses, grateful, dipped their heads, lips rippling across the surface, before raising wet muzzles to drip into the straw. The knight might sit nearby, polishing bits of tack, or watching the play of light across the fields. In such moments, horse and rider shared a companionship that required no words, built not through the trial of war but through the repetition of daily care. Evenings brought another rhythm. As the sky darkened and the chapel bells tolled, the knight would return to the stable once more. The smell of warm hay deepened, the quiet of animals settling down filled the space. Horses shifted into stillness, their breaths slow, their eyes half closed. The knight might walk between stalls, pausing to rest a hand on each neck, murmuring softly before drawing the wooden doors closed against the night. To end the day in the presence of these animals was to end it in trust. They stood as guardians of quiet strength, as companions who needed no victories to justify their worth. The bond between knight and horse was not merely practical, it was deeply emotional. Horses had personalities, quirks, and tempers. Some were spirited and required patience, others were gentle and eager to please. A knight who spent years with the same steed learned its moods, its preferences, the meaning of each sound it made. In turn, the horse learned the weight of his rider, the tone of his voice, the pressure of his hand. Trust grew not in moments of crisis, but in thousands of quiet exchanges, in the rhythm of hooves across soil, in the shared silence of journeys through mist and meadow. It is easy to forget how much of medieval life depended on these animals. Not only knights but entire communities relied on horses for ploughing, for hauling carts, for carrying goods to market. The knight's horse, though often bred for strength and stature, was part of this broader web of reliance. Its presence connected fields to villages, manors to chapels, people to people. When a knight who never saw battle cared for his horse, he was also caring for the lifeline of his estate, the link that kept daily life moving with quiet steadiness. There was poetry, too, in the sight of a horse at rest. Imagine a summer afternoon, the knight standing at the edge of a paddock, while his steed grazed freely, its coat shining like polished bronze beneath the sun. The slow rip of grass, the flick of a tail, the steady rhythm of chewing, these sounds became the soundtrack of peace. A bird might settle on a fence post, a breeze might stir the leaves of nearby trees, and the knight, leaning on the rail, would feel that this was enough. There was no need for trumpets or banners. Here, in the simple company of his horse, life's purpose felt complete. In winter, the bond was tested differently. Snow gathered against the stable walls, wind howled through cracks, and icy drafts made every task heavier. Yet the knight returned daily, carrying water warmed from the hearth, scattering extra hay, and ensuring blankets covered his horse's back. These acts of care, repeated in the cold, strengthened the partnership. The horse trusted that no season would leave it abandoned. The knight trusted that no season would leave him without his loyal companion. Together, they endured the cycles of the year, their bond woven tighter with each passing season. Sometimes, pilgrims remembered the sight of such knights traveling quietly on horseback, offering greetings along dusty roads. Not armored figures with lances raised, but solitary riders moving at a gentle pace, their horses' hooves raising only soft clouds of dust. To see them was to be reminded that knighthood was not only about combat, but about presence, about carrying dignity into everyday journeys. The horse, adorned not with armor but with simple tack, embodied this dignity as well, moving with grace. Even in the absence of spectacle, the chronicles of history rarely record these details. They tell of battles, of charges, of horses wounded, and knights victorious or defeated. Yet behind those louder stories lies this quieter truth. For every horse that thundered into war, there were others who never did. Their legacy was not destruction but endurance, not violence but companionship. They carried their knights through lives of service, over fields golden with harvest, down roads lined with hedges, through villages where bells rang across rooftops. Their hoofbeats were the pulse of peace, steady and unwavering. To walk into the stable at dusk and hear the slow breathing of horses, to feel the warmth of their bodies in the cold night, to brush their coats until they shone under lantern light, these were the victories of knights who never went to war. In such moments, they found strength not in conquest but in constancy, not in dominance but in devotion. The chapel bells might mark the hours, but the sound of hooves across the earth marked the days. Together, knight and horse lived lives of steady rhythm, their partnership a gentle reminder that even in an age famed for battle, peace had its own champions. Life on a knight's estate was not a matter of sudden upheaval or swift glory, but of patience, repetition, and gentle rhythms that followed the slow turn of the seasons. Unlike the chronicles of battle, where time was measured in campaigns, marches, and victories, the life of a knight who never went to war unfolded in cycles as old as the earth itself. Spring returned with its green shoots and its promise of renewal. Summer ripened fields beneath long golden days. Autumn brought gathering and gratitude, while winter drew the household inward, where the hearth's glow carried them through darkness and frost. For such a knight, his estate was not merely land to be held, it was a small world unto itself, with duties that tied him as firmly as any oath of loyalty. He watched over fields, orchards, tenants, and animals with the same quiet constancy that others gave to banners and swords. His reward was not renown but continuity, the sense that life endured steadily, season after season. When spring began to stir, the first signs were felt not in the manor but in the soil. Frost retreated, rains softened the earth, and buds broke open on hedgerows and orchard trees. Farmers emerged from their cottages, tools slung over their shoulders, and made their way to the fields. The knight walked with them, not in armor but in a simple cloak, boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. He carried no weapon save perhaps a staff, used to steady his steps on uneven paths. His presence was not a command but an encouragement, a reminder that the estate's strength lay in the hands of many. Together they oversaw the ploughing, oxen pulling wooden ploughs, while men guided them carefully across the furrows. The smell of fresh-turned earth rose into the cool air, a scent both sharp and hopeful. Children carried baskets of seed, following their parents, scattering grain into the soil that would one day become bread for the household. The knight's role was not to labor as a farmer, but to ensure that tools were sound, that oxen were healthy, and that each family had what it needed. To work the land, he paused often, speaking gently with workers, listening to their concerns, and offering small words of encouragement. Sometimes he carried with him a pouch of coin, giving out modest tokens to those who had suffered through the lean winter with particular difficulty. The spring planting was not just about crops. It was about reaffirming bonds between lord and tenant, about ensuring that no one was left behind as the year began anew. Summer came with a different rhythm. The fields grew tall with barley, wheat, and oats, their stalks rippling like waves when the wind passed over them. The knight rode slowly along the field edges, his horse's pace unhurried, his gaze sweeping across the acres of grain. He watched for signs of blight or pests, for weak fences that might allow deer to enter, for the health of orchards where apples and pears swelled beneath green leaves. The air was thick with the hum of bees, with the calls of birds darting across the sky, with the steady sound of scythes sharpening in preparation for the harvest yet to come. Summer was also a time for tending orchards and gardens. Within the estate's walls, kitchen plots grew herbs, cabbages, onions, and beans. Women weeded the rows, children fetched water from the well, and the knight himself sometimes paused to kneel among the plants, plucking weeds or examining the leaves for disease. It was humble work, far removed from the image of a knight in shining armor, but it tied him to the same earth that fed his tenants. In the shade of trees, he walked with retainers, speaking not of war, but of weather, of harvest prospects, of repairs needed to barns or fences. His summer days were long, but not restless. They flowed with the slow pace of ripening fruit and the patient labor of those who lived by the land. Autumn was the season of gathering, a time when the estate moved as one in a shared effort. Harvest began at dawn, scythes cutting through fields heavy with grain. workers bending low to bind sheaves, carts creaking as they carried the bounty toward barns. The knight often joined these labors, not with scythe in hand, but with presence that lifted spirits. He carried waterskins to the weary, tasted the first loaves of new bread, and stood beside his people as they worked. At night, when the harvest was secure, celebrations filled the manor hall. Tables groaned under platters of roasted meats, bread still warm from ovens, and fruits laid out in abundance. Music drifted through the air, simple pipes, fiddles, or the beat of drums. The knight sat among his tenants, not apart from them, raising a cup in gratitude for their labor and for the turning of another year. These were nights of laughter and song, when shadows of hardship receded and the estate felt whole. Winter, by contrast, pressed people indoors. Frost crept across windows, snow piled against doors, and fields lay silent under a blanket of white. For the knight, this was a time of stewardship, not in the fields, but within the household. Long evenings were spent beside the hearth, where flames crackled and threw shadows across stone walls. Families gathered to tell stories, to sing, to mend tools and garments by lamplight. The knight listened more than he spoke, content to let the rhythm of voices fill the hall. Children played near the fire, carving small figures from wood or tracing patterns in the ashes. Retainers shared tales of past years, harvests, storms, or even the occasional far-off rumor of war that seemed distant and unreal in the snug warmth of the estate. Winter also demanded careful planning. The knight walked through stores of grain, meat, and dried fruit, ensuring supplies would last until spring. He checked that livestock were properly sheltered, their stalls thick with straw to ward off the cold. He made sure that those in the village had fuel for their fires, sometimes sending cartloads of wood to cottages where need was greatest. His role in winter was that of guardian, making sure no one went hungry, no one froze, and no one felt forgotten. These acts of quiet care were as noble as any battlefield feat, though they seldom reached the ears of chroniclers. Across all seasons, the rhythm of estate life was both practical and deeply symbolic. Spring's planting spoke of hope, summer's tending of patience, autumn's harvest of gratitude, and winter's stillness of endurance. The knight, by living through these cycles with his people, became more than their lord. He became a part of their shared story, woven into the fabric of their lives. His armor, often polished yet unused, stood as a silent reminder of what might have been, but his true legacy was in the turning of the seasons, in the land that flourished under his watch, in the people who thrived through his quiet guardianship. The chronicles of knights who fought in great wars are filled with tales of banners and bloodshed, but the chronicles of knights who never fought were written in furrows of fields, in laughter at harvest feasts, in the warmth of fires that carried villagers through long nights. These chronicles did not fade with victory or defeat. They endured as long as the land itself. The estate, with its slow cycles, stood as testament to a different kind of knighthood, one where honor was measured, not by conquest but by continuity, not by glory but by care. Thus the quiet seasons of the estate became the true battlefield of patience, discipline, and compassion. The knight rose each day not to charge against enemies, but to face the steady demands of time, weather, and need. His victories were measured in fields that yielded grain, in families who gathered safely at hearths, in orchards heavy with fruit, in tenants who survived winter with dignity. And when the bells of the chapel marked the hours, they did not call him to arms but to prayer, reminding him that the rhythms of land and life were sacred. In those rhythms, he found meaning deeper than any battle could offer. The market day was unlike any other rhythm of the estate. Whereas the slow turn of the seasons governed planting, harvest, and rest, the market injected life into the village square in bursts of color, noise, and motion. It was a day when roads that were often quiet suddenly bustled with footsteps, hooves, and the creak of wagons. Villagers rose before dawn, loading their carts with wool, pottery, salted fish, dried herbs, or baskets of apples, each family hoping to earn enough to sustain themselves for the coming week. For the knight who never rode to battle, these market days were not diversions but duties, occasions to walk among his people, to ensure fairness, and to safeguard the fragile trust that bound his estate together. By mid-morning, the square filled with stalls, some little more than rough tables of wood, others shaded by bright awnings sewn from coarse fabric. The air carried the mingled scents of baking bread, smoked meats, wool newly sheared, and, on rare occasions, spices brought from faraway coasts, colors that seldom appeared in daily peasant life, dyed cloth of deep blue, crimson threads, or glazed pottery seemed to glow against the simpler backdrop of earthen walls and thatched roofs. For many villagers, these sights were as wondrous as any pageantry at a noble's court, and for the knight, they were reminders that even in a life without war, there were encounters with beauty, exchange, and the wider world. The knight's presence at market was not marked by banners or trumpets. He came quietly, often on horseback, but dismounting to walk the rows on foot, so that he could meet eyes and speak with stallholders. His armor remained in the manor, replaced by a tunic of plain but fine wool, a belt at his waist, and a simple dagger at his side, not a weapon of aggression but of custom. Villagers greeted him with a respectful nod, sometimes bowing, though many had grown comfortable enough to speak freely. He listened to their prices, asked about the quality of their goods, and sometimes purchased small items himself, a new jug for the hall, a pouch of dried berries, or a carved toy for a child within his household. These exchanges were more than transactions. They were gestures of solidarity, signs that lord and tenant shared in the same daily needs. Disputes, however, were inevitable. Two men might argue over the measure of grain. A woman might accuse a neighbor of diluting milk with water, or rival craftsmen might quarrel over who had the right to a favored stall. In such moments, the knight's role became most visible. He did not shout, nor did he strike down offenders with sword or spear. Instead, he listened. He called for witnesses, weighed goods with his own hands, and spoke judgments that were firm, yet fair. His goal was not to punish but to restore balance, so that the market could continue without bitterness festering into feuds. His presence reminded all that peace was the foundation upon which trade rested. Coins exchanged hands constantly, their metallic clink punctuating the rhythm of the day. The knight himself sometimes carried a small coffer, ensuring that were paid promptly when the estate purchased supplies in bulk, grain for the manor kitchens, fabric for clothing retainers, tools for the blacksmith's forge. He knew the feel of coin between his fingers as intimately as he once trained to know the weight of a sword. Silver pennies and copper farthings became his tools of stability, the means by which he sustained not only his household but the livelihoods of those who depended upon him. Yet the market was more than commerce, it was also connection. Travelers often passed through, bringing tales of distant towns, of changing fashions, of rumors from across seas or mountains. Pilgrims might arrive seeking food and rest before continuing toward holy shrines. Minstrels and jugglers sometimes added music and spectacle, drawing children to laugh and clap while adults bartered nearby. The knight, though quiet by nature, found value in these encounters. They reminded him that his estate, though enclosed by fields and woods, was not isolated from the larger currents of the realm. He would sometimes pause to hear a ballad of far-off places, paying the singer with a coin and a smile, even though he knew he might never see the lands described. At midday, when the sun hung high, the square became a place not just of trade, but of shared meals. Vendors sold hot pies filled with meat and onions, honey cakes wrapped in cloth, and mugs of ale foaming at the rim. The knight often sat at a simple bench, eating alongside villagers, speaking with them in tones of ease rather than command. These were moments when the distance between noble and tenant softened, when the entire community felt like a single body gathered for sustenance. It was here that trust deepened, for it was one thing to rule from a hall and another to share bread in the open air. Market days also revealed the hidden economy of generosity. A poor widow might be given a loaf without payment, a sick child a small bundle of herbs. The knight himself sometimes instructed stallholders to allow the needy to take what they required, paying for it quietly later so that pride was preserved. He understood that charity, when handled with discretion, strengthened bonds rather than humiliating those it sought to help. This quiet generosity, though unrecorded by chroniclers, was as much a legacy of knighthood as any tournament victory. As the afternoon lengthened, shadows stretched across the square, and the bustle began to slow. Wagons filled with unsold goods creaked homeward, while satisfied buyers carried their purchases in baskets or sacks. The knight made one last circuit of the market, ensuring that no disputes lingered unresolved, and that travelers knew the safest paths to inns or neighboring villages. He sometimes escorted pilgrims part way, his horse carrying him easily along the road. before returning to the manor as the evening bells rang. In the hush that followed, the market square appeared transformed. Where once there had been color and noise, only trampled straw and the faint scent of spices remained. The knight looked upon it with quiet satisfaction. The day had been lively but peaceful, filled with the small exchanges that knit a community together. There had been no swords drawn, no banners raised, no victories declared. Yet in the calm flow of goods and the fairness of trade, there lay a different kind of triumph, the triumph of stability, of people able to live and labor without fear. For the knight, market days were lessons in humility. They taught him that strength was not only the ability to wield arms, but also the capacity to foster fairness, to listen with patience, and to guide disputes toward peace. He came to see that the true wealth of his estate was not counted merely in coin or goods, but in the trust of his people, in the knowledge that they could gather openly without fear of theft, violence, or exploitation. This, more than any battle, glory, was the measure of his success. Thus, week after week, season after season, market days became threads in the tapestry of estate life. They reflected not conquest, but continuity, not the clash of steel, but the murmur of bargaining, the laughter of children, the quiet nod of agreement between buyer and seller. For the knight, these days were not diversions from duty, but the very heart of it, proof that stewardship was as noble as warfare, and that peace, though less celebrated, was the foundation upon which all else endured. The world of the knight is often remembered for its armor, horses, and codes of honor. Yet behind the clang of imagined steel and the gleam of polished helmets lay another, quieter tradition. Some knights, never called to battle, found their purpose not on the field but at the desk. Their weapons were quills, their shields sheets of parchment, and their victories the careful preservation of memory. Within the walls of manor houses and chapels, they became custodians of words, guardians of ink, and keepers of the small histories that made up the fabric of daily life. Imagine a wooden desk, worn smooth by decades of use, placed near a narrow window where daylight filtered in through horn panes or shutters. On the desk rests a jar of ink, dark and gleaming, beside a knife for trimming quills. Sheets of parchment lie stacked, some crisp and new, others yellowed with age. The knight sits in a plain chair, shoulders heavy from the weight of years, but his hand steady as he guides the quill across the surface. Each stroke leaves a trail of black lines, forming words that would outlast the moment. Around him, the hall is quiet save for the faint crackle of the hearth and the distant sound of chickens in the yard. Writing was not an easy skill to master, and not all knights possessed it. For many, scribes and clerks handled letters and records, but there were those who took pride in learning themselves, who understood that words carried a different kind of power. They studied under monks or abbots, practicing letters by candlelight until their hands could form steady lines. Some learned Latin, the language of the church and law. Others wrote in the vernacular, so that their records could be understood by successors without translation. In their notebooks, margins filled with small sketches of vines, birds, or simple symbols, we glimpse a personal touch, evidence that these knights were not only overseers of land, but also men of thought. Their writings covered many subjects, though seldom the grand tales of war. A ledger might note the yield of wheat from a particular field, the health of cattle, or the repairs needed on a bridge. Letters carried to neighboring estates asked for advice on managing tenants, or conveyed thanks for gifts of fruit or cloth. Some knights wrote to abbots or bishops, requesting blessings for their land, or describing the weather to explain poor harvests. In these simple lines, ink turned into testimony, a mirror of ordinary life preserved against forgetting. The act of writing itself shaped the rhythm of their days. Morning tasks might bring them to the fields, but as the sun rose higher, they returned indoors, seated themselves at their desk, and opened the tools of their trade. The scratch of the quill became part of the household soundscape, familiar to retainers and servants. Children might peek through doors, watching curiously as words formed under the knight's hand. For them, the sight of their master writing was almost as impressive as the gleam of armor on festival days. It was a reminder that learning, too, held dignity. Letters traveled slowly across the countryside. Messengers on horseback carried folded sheets, sealed with wax, winding along muddy roads and through forests. Some were lost to rain or misfortune, but others arrived, days or weeks later, to the hands of distant kin or fellow stewards. In these exchanges the knight's voice stretched beyond the walls of his manor, reaching those he might not see for months or years. Replies came in the same fashion, sometimes short and practical, other times long and reflective. To hold a letter was to hold a piece of another life, a fragment of connection made tangible through ink and parchment. The physicality of these documents was striking. Parchment was costly, made from animal skin carefully prepared. Ink was mixed from oak galls, iron salts, and gum, producing a rich black that darkened over time. Quills were shaped from feathers, their tips trimmed again and again as they wore down. Each letter written carried the weight of effort and expense. Nothing was wasted, margins were filled, and blank spaces often reused. For this reason, every word chosen mattered. A knight might spend long minutes deciding how best to phrase a request or record an event, aware that these sheets could be read by generations to come. Some writings were deeply personal. A knight might keep a journal of weather, noting the first frost, the heavy rains of spring, or the rare years of drought. Others wrote reflections on faith, copying verses of scripture or composing prayers of their own. In such records, we hear their private voices, gentle, uncertain, hopeful. These were not words for courts or chronicles, but for themselves, preserved in the hope of order and understanding. In the margins, perhaps, they sketched the outlines of leaves, or recorded the name of a newborn calf. Such details remind us that life, even for those bound to service and estate, was intimate and textured. The knight at his desk became almost monastic in routine. While others thought of knights as restless riders, he found contentment in stillness. There was discipline in his posture, patience in his strokes, and humility in his acceptance that many of his words would never travel far, yet he knew that memory, once fixed in ink, had strength of its own. A quarrel settled between neighbors, a list of tools lent to a blacksmith, or a record of rents paid might one day serve as proof, protecting his people from injustice. In such quiet ways, his writing became a shield more enduring than steel. Evenings deepened the solemnity of this task. As the sun sank, lamps were lit, small flames sheltered within horn coverings to soften their glow. Shadows lengthened across the desk as the knight leaned closer to see his page. The household grew quieter, servants retiring, animals settled, until the hall was hushed, but for the faint drip of wax and the gentle rasp of the quill. In that silence, writing became almost prayer, a meditative act, binding thought to page, in a rhythm that calmed the mind as much as it preserved memory. Some of these knights left behind collections of letters or accounts that survive, tucked away in archives or libraries centuries later. They may appear modest compared to chronicles of kings or wars, but their value lies in their intimacy. From them we learn how many sheep grazed a hillside, how often bridges washed away, how villages celebrated feast days, and how weather shaped harvests. These are the fragments that show us life not as legend, but as reality. Through their ink, we see that history was not only made by armies, but also by quiet men at their desks, choosing words with care. The language of letters gave knights a different kind of voice. It allowed them to speak beyond distance, beyond time, to share their concerns, their joys, and their duties. In doing so, they contributed to a tradition of writing that shaped Europe's memory, where land charters, wills, and personal notes blended into the larger record of the medieval world. Their words bridged generations, ensuring that their stewardship, however humble, would not vanish with the turning of seasons. As night closed around the manor, the knight laid down his quill, capped his ink, and placed his sheets carefully aside. He stretched his hands, stiff from labor, and gazed at the neat lines across the page. No one else might ever see them, yet he felt the quiet satisfaction of work completed, of memory preserved. The hearth crackled softly, casting warm light upon the parchment. Outside, the wind stirred through trees, carrying the faint toll of chapel bells across the valley. In that moment, the knight was not a warrior, not a figure of conquest, but a recorder of life's gentle passage. His words, humble though they seemed, were his offering to time. Thus, the knight's world was shaped as much by letters as by swords. Where others sought renown in battle, he found meaning in ink. His legacy was not the charge of horses, but the steady scratch of quill upon parchment. And though his name may not be remembered in chronicles, the lines he left remain as quiet witnesses, reminding us that history is not only the story of kings and conquests, but also of those who sat patiently at their desks, writing the life of their people one word at a time. When the day's work was done and the last traces of light slipped away beyond the hedgerows and distant fields, the manor hall became the center of life. Its stone walls, cooled by day, grew warmer by evening. As fires in the great hearth leaped higher and cast their glow upon timber-bird beams, shadows stretched and swayed along the surfaces, their movements softened by the flicker of flame. And within this chamber, so often associated with solemn meals and serious discussions, came a gentler rhythm of life. Music. For the knights who never rode into war, music became their companion, their comfort, and their memory. Its softened silence filled the air with meaning and turned the stone heart of the hall into a place of warmth and gathering. Evenings often began quietly. Servants cleared the remnants of the evening meal. Wooden trenchers wiped clean jugs of ale half emptied, and benches drawn nearer to the hearth. The knight, seated in his chair, allowed the weight of the day to slip from his shoulders. Instead of armor resting at his side, there might be a cloak of wool pulled close, or a carved staff leaning against the table. Around him, retainers settled, their voices low, their laughter occasional, their eyes turning toward the musicians who would soon bring sound into the quiet. Minstrels were the bearers of this gift. They traveled from hall to hall carrying lutes, harps, or small flutes tucked into cases of leather. Their arrival was never unremarkable. Villagers might whisper about them as they passed through gates, and children, eager for novelty, followed their steps. For the knight, their presence was both duty and delight. To host a minstrel was to honor tradition, to offer food, drink, and shelter in return for stories and songs that wove the household into the broader world of tales and memory. These performers were the keepers of law, and even knights who never fought knew that music preserved history in ways words alone could not. As the minstrel tuned the strings of his lute or drew a bow across the harp, the hall grew hushed. The faint creak of the strings, the quiet coughs of those waiting, the low crackle of the fire, these became part of the prelude. Then, with a single strum, sound bloomed into the air, carrying warmth beyond that of the fire. Melodies rose and lingered beneath the rafters, echoing softly against stone, filling the chamber with threads of beauty, invisible yet deeply felt. Songs varied with the season and the setting. Some were ballads of the land itself, tunes that celebrated the arrival of spring, the ripening of grain, the turning of leaves in autumn. Others were prayers set to music, words of devotion carried more deeply by melody than by speech. There were also tales of distant places, sung in gentle rhythms that transported listeners beyond their own valley. A knight might close his eyes and imagine foreign shores, mountains wrapped in mist, or cities with golden spires, all conjured by the rise and fall of song. The effect was transformative. Stone walls, once cold and immovable, seemed to soften as voices blended with instruments. Faces, lined by work and age, brightened with smiles. For the knight, weary from his state duties, music lifted burdens he could not lay aside with coin or command. The hall became less a chamber of responsibility and more a sanctuary of harmony. In such moments, melody became a shield against the loneliness of leadership and the relentless passing of time. There were times when the knight himself joined the music. Some knights learned simple tunes on the harp, or kept small flutes at hand for their own amusement. Though not professionals, they delighted in adding their voice or instrument to the gathering. Their participation was not judged by skill, but by sincerity. A deep voice humming along to a chorus, or a clumsy strum of lute strings, was met not with criticism, but with shared laughter. For those present, the knight's willingness to sing reminded them that he, too, was part of the household, human, fallible, and joyful. Music carried memories. Old songs recalled ancestors long past, battles fought by forefathers, and loves cherished and lost. Even knights who never went to war felt the tug of these histories, for they belonged to the lineage of their land. Listening to such ballads, they understood themselves as part of something larger, a chain of generations bound not only by estates and titles, but also by the melodies that carried identity across centuries. In this sense, music was as much inheritance as soil or stone. On winter nights, when snow pressed against shutters and the air outside was sharp with frost, music offered warmth more profound than fire alone. Cloaks were drawn tight, mugs of spiced ale warmed hands, and minstrels plucked slow, steady tunes that matched the hush of the world beyond the hall. On summer evenings, with windows thrown open and breezes stirring banners, livelier melodies drifted into the fields, mingling with the chirp of crickets and the scent of hay. Each season shaped the music, and in turn, music shaped the memory of each season. Not all songs were solemn. Many were playful, filled with riddles or light-hearted tales. Children clapped to their rhythms, and servants grinned at their jokes. A minstrel's wit could turn the hall into a place of laughter, relieving the weight of responsibility that often hung heavy over the knight and his household. Such levity was precious, for joy, like song, had the power to bind communities as firmly as laws or oaths. When the final song faded and silence returned, it was never an emptiness. The echoes of melody lingered in memory, a kind of afterglow that settled gently upon the hall. The knight would rise slowly, thank the minstrel, and offer a bed for the night or provisions for the road. Retainers drifted to their chambers, still humming fragments of tune, while servants banked the fire and closed the shutters against the night. The hall, once alive with sound, now embraced stillness again, holding within its stones the resonance of what had passed. For the knight, lying in his chamber, music followed into sleep. The melodies replayed in thought, soft as dreams, carrying him into rest. In those quiet hours, the armor he never wore in battle seemed unnecessary, for he possessed another form of defense, the comfort of song, the shield of harmony, the companionship of voices raised together in peace. Thus, music was not an ornament of knightly life, but a necessity. It sustained spirits, strengthened bonds, and preserved traditions. More than that, it offered a counterpoint to silence, ensuring that even those knights who never went to war were not forgotten by time. Their halls, though absent of battle cries, resounded instead with notes of melody. And perhaps this, more than any clash of arms, was their true legacy: to transform stone into song, duty into delight, and solitude into harmony. When we think of a knight, it is easy to picture heavy armor, polished steel, and the thunder of hooves. Yet, for many knights who never went to war, the tools of daily life were far gentler. Instead of swords, they held small knives for trimming. Plants, instead of banners, they tended rows of herbs, each leaf carefully nurtured under sun and rain. Their gardens were not places of conquest but of care, and in these quiet plots of earth, they discovered another form of guardianship, protecting health, easing discomfort, and offering peace through remedies grown by hand. The gardens themselves were simple yet orderly. Stone walls or wooden fences often enclosed them, keeping animals from trampling the delicate plants. Narrow paths divided the beds, laid with gravel or trodden soil, so that the knight or his helpers could move easily among the rows. In the mornings, dew clung to leaves, sparkling as the first light of sun reached over rooftops. Birds hopped along the edges, searching for insects, while bees moved steadily from bloom to bloom. The air was filled with fragrance, the soft sweetness of chamomile, the sharp freshness of rosemary, the earthy strength of sage. For anyone walking there, the garden was both a workplace and a place of quiet reflection. Knights did not always work alone. Often they learned from monks, apothecaries, or wise women of the village. These teachers passed on knowledge gathered over generations: what to pick in summer, what to dry in winter, how to mix one herb with another to strengthen its effect. Such lessons were as valuable as martial training, for they equipped the knight with skills to protect life rather than take it. Apprentices, pages, or even children of the household might accompany him into the garden, carrying baskets, listening as he explained the difference between leaves that healed and those that harmed. Each plant had its purpose. Chamomile, with its small white flowers and golden centers, was gathered carefully and dried for tea. Its gentle strength calmed stomachs and soothed troubled sleep. Sage, with gray-green leaves, was believed to sharpen memory and cleanse wounds. Rosemary, with its needle-like sprigs, carried both fragrance and healing, used in tonics for circulation or burned to freshen the air. Mint cooled fevers, thyme eased coughs, and lavender, when hung in bundles, brought a sense of calm to chambers darkened by worry. To walk among these rows was to wander through a living apothecary, a treasury of health rooted in soil. Harvesting was done with care. A knight bent low, knife in hand, cutting stems cleanly so the plant might grow again. Flowers were gathered just before full bloom, leaves while still young and tender. The gathered herbs were tied in small bundles, hung in airy lofts, or spread upon linen to dry. Weeks later, they were stored in jars or cloth pouches. their scents preserved for the cold months when gardens slept. The sight of shelves lined with herbs gave reassurance, a quiet armory, not of weapons but of remedies ready for use. When illness touched the household, these stores came into service. A retainer, feverish from winter's chill, was given a warm infusion of chamomile and honey. A child coughing through the night breathed easier after time was steeped and steam inhaled. Cuts from tools in the field were washed with sage water, their pain lessened by poultices made from mashed leaves. For restless minds weighed down by worry, lavender was placed beneath pillows, its fragrance easing the path into sleep. The knight, though no physician, became a steward of small mercies, his knowledge saving pain, perhaps even lives, in ways as noble as any victory. The garden was more than medicine. It was also a sanctuary. After long days of estate duties, hearing disputes, managing rents, walking the fields, the knight could step into his garden and find quiet. The steady rhythm of pulling weeds, watering plants, and gathering herbs calmed thoughts. Butterflies drifting from bloom to bloom seemed like living ornaments, their fragile wings catching the sun. Bees hummed a steady chorus, their labor reminding the knight of industry and patience. In such moments, he was not master or lord, but a simple caretaker of earth, humbled by the cycles of growth and decay. Seasons shaped the garden's life. In spring, the soil was tilled, seeds planted, and shoots eagerly watched as they broke. Through the surface, summer brought abundance, the beds filled with green and blossom, air heavy with fragrance. Autumn meant gathering and storing, preparing against the barrenness of winter. And even in the cold months, the knight sometimes walked the sleeping garden. Snow covering the paths, herbs dormant beneath the soil, yet promising renewal when warmth returned. These cycles mirrored his own life, teaching patience, resilience, and acceptance. Festivals often drew upon the bounty of these gardens. At midsummer, sprigs of herbs were woven into garlands hung above doors, believed to ward off illness and misfortune. On feast days, rosemary or mint-flavored meats, thyme, enriched stews, and lavender-sweetened baked goods. In these moments, the garden nourished not only the body but also the spirit of celebration, reminding all who tasted and smelled that joy, too, could be cultivated in the soil. Correspondence sometimes mentioned these practices. Letters from knights to abbots spoke of poor harvests of sage, or requests for rare seeds from distant monasteries. Exchanges of herbs became tokens of friendship, much like gifts of wine or cloth. The shared language of healing plants connected estates across miles, weaving a quiet network of care. Through such exchanges, knowledge grew, recipes for ointments, instructions for teas, and warnings against harmful mixtures passed from hand to hand, strengthening communities in unseen ways. There was, in all this, a deep sense of humility. Unlike war, where victory was swift and visible, healing was slow, uncertain, and often incomplete. A knight might prepare an infusion with care, yet the fever lingered. He might bandage a wound, yet the scar remained. Such experiences taught patience, and also reverence for forces beyond control. Life could not always be saved, but comfort could always be offered. This gentleness, this willingness to serve rather than command, was perhaps the truest expression of knighthood for those who never fought. At dusk, when work in the garden was done, the knight often paused before leaving. He stood among the rows, inhaling the mingled scents as the sun dipped low. The air cooled, bees returned to hives, and birds called from hedges. The garden seemed to exhale, its labor finished for the day. The knight, too, exhaled, carrying with him into the hall not only the herbs gathered in baskets, but also the peace gathered in spirit. The garden was both medicine chest and chapel, teaching him that health, like faith, required quiet tending. Thus these knights, remembered not for battles but for leaves and flowers, carried a legacy of care. They guarded their households not with swords but with remedies, ensuring that illness was met with kindness, discomfort with relief. In their gardens, they practiced a slower, gentler knighthood, one that looked not outward toward conquest but inward toward preservation of life. And though their names seldom appear in chronicles of war, their quiet remedies left imprints upon generations, shaping lives as surely as any campaign. When winter arrived in the medieval countryside, it brought with it a profound stillness that touched every part of life. The fields, once alive with green shoots and the rhythm of work, lay bare beneath blankets of snow. Trees stood motionless, their branches stark against the pale sky, and rivers slowed under sheets of ice. For knights who never rode into battle, this season was not one of campaigns or marches, but of patience, of waiting, and of quiet endurance. Their armor, polished but unused, hung on wooden stands, while their cloaks and furs became daily companions. Against the cold, the long evenings, stretching far beyond the light of day, shaped a rhythm of life that was slower, softer, and deeply reflective. The soundscape of winter was unlike any other. Outside, the crunch of boots on frost broke the silence of the night. The call of a distant owl or the muffled bark of a dog drifted through the crisp air, carrying farther than usual in the cold. Yet for the most part, the land was hushed. Snow absorbed noise, turning the world into a place where even the smallest stir a branch cracking under weight of ice, a crow's sudden cry felt magnified. For the knight within his hall, these sounds were reminders that life endured outside, though in muted, hidden forms. The animals in the stable stamped their hooves for warmth, the horses breathing clouds of vapor into the air, while hens tucked themselves into straw. Every creature, like every person, seemed to wait out the cold in its own way. Within the walls of the hall, however, warmth and life gathered around the hearth. The fire was the heart of winter evenings. Logs, carried in from the woodpile, hissed and crackled as they burned, filling the room with a glow that softened stone walls and heavy beams. Shadows flickered across tapestries and wooden panels, moving like silent storytellers of their own. Around this fire sat the knight, his family, retainers, and sometimes neighbors seeking company. Together they shared not only warmth but also time to mend, to create, and to remember. Winter was a season of repair. By firelight, tools dulled from months of use were sharpened, wooden handles polished, and harnesses stitched. Clothes, worn thin, were patched, wool was spun, and cloth was woven on looms whose steady rhythm echoed the patience of the season. The knight, though not always skilled in these crafts, watched with quiet pride as his household worked. Sometimes he joined, mending small items or carving simple objects from wood. These acts, humble as they were, kept the estate whole. Nothing was wasted in winter, and every hand had a role to play. Food, too, carried its own rhythm. The bounty of harvest, stored in cellars and pantries, became the diet of the cold months. Stews simmered over the fire, thick with root vegetables, salted meats, and herbs dried in autumn. Bread, baked from stored grain, filled the hall with familiar fragrance. Cheeses aged in cool rooms were brought forth, and ale brewed months before was poured into mugs that warmed cold hands. Meals were not feasts of abundance, but they were steady, nourishing, and shared with gratitude. At times, the knight himself carried bowls to servants or children, reinforcing the sense that winter's survival was a collective effort. As evenings stretched on, stories filled the space between tasks. Old tales of ancestors, legends of saints, and simple recollections of past seasons were spoken aloud, weaving voices together in memory. A knight might recount journeys to nearby markets, disputes settled fairly, or small moments of kindness witnessed in the village. These were not tales of war or conquest, but of daily endurance, of the quiet victories of life lived with steadiness. Younger listeners leaned close, eyes reflecting firelight, while elders nodded in agreement or gently corrected details. In this way, history passed not through books but through voices, becoming part of the rhythm of winter evenings. Books, however, did appear, for some knights had them, though few owned many. A treasured volume perhaps, a psalter, a book of hours, or a collection of saints' lives was read aloud by candlelight. The knight, or sometimes a literate clerk, traced the lines slowly, each word illuminated by the wavering flame. To hear scripture or verse in the long dark of winter brought comfort. The words reminded all present that patience and endurance were not only necessities of the season but also virtues of the soul. In listening, the hall seemed to lean into silence, broken only by the steady voice and the occasional crack of the fire. Outside the hall, the snow built up along roofs and fences. Paths had to be cleared, animals fed, and fires tended through the night. These tasks, though hard in the cold, were softened by routine. A knight, walking out with a lantern in hand, felt the world shrink to the circle of light around him. The sky above was vast and sharp with stars, their brightness unmuted by summer haze. His breath rose like smoke, and the silence of the fields pressed close. Returning inside, the contrast of warmth and company felt like a blessing. Winter reminded him of fragility, yet also of resilience. Patience was perhaps the greatest lesson of these evenings. Unlike campaigns, which demanded sudden action and brought swift outcomes, winter taught endurance without haste. Crops could not be planted until spring. Journeys could not be made until roads cleared, and disputes often paused until travel was safe again. The night, so often thought of as a figure of action, instead became a figure of waiting. This waiting was not idle but filled with quiet labor, reflection, and care for others. In enduring the long nights together, bonds of trust and community deepened. Children found joy in small things: a carved toy, the glow of the fire, the sound of wind rattling shutters while they felt safe inside. Women of the household hummed songs as they spun or sewed, their melodies soft and steady. Even the night, whose image in stories might be one of stern command, softened into laughter or gentle words. The season stripped away the distractions of fields and journeys, leaving only the essentials: warmth, food, shelter, and companionship. Faith also found its place in these evenings. The chapel, though colder in winter, still called with the sound of bells. Knights walked through snow to attend mass, breath visible in the frigid air, cloaks pulled tightly against the wind. Inside the small stone building, candles flickered, their light mirrored in frost-covered windows. The prayers spoken there echoed the patience of the season: pleas for health, gratitude for shelter, and hope for spring's return. Returning home, the knight carried this stillness with him, another form of warmth to be shared with his household. As weeks passed, subtle changes marked the slow approach of spring. Days lengthened, snow melted into rivulets along paths, and the air carried the faint scent of thawing earth. Yet winter's grip lingered, and so the evenings remained long, filled with the same steady rituals. The knight, now accustomed to the rhythm, found comfort in it. Though the world outside seemed still, life within the hall pulsed with quiet strength. In truth, winter's long evenings revealed a different kind of knighthood, not one of banners and charges, but one of guardianship in its simplest form, guarding warmth, guarding food, guarding the well-being of those within his care. Each night survived together was a victory, not written in chronicles but remembered in the hearts of those who lived through it. As the fire burned low and the hall grew quiet, the knight often sat for a moment longer, gazing into the embers. The wind pressed against the shutters, but inside, peace lingered. He thought of the seasons behind and the seasons ahead, knowing that his role was not to conquer but to endure, to protect through patience as much as through strength. Winter had its hardships, but in its stillness, it also offered a gift: time. Time to reflect, time to mend, and time to draw close to others. And so, though the nights were long, they were not empty. They were full of quiet meaning. The roads of the medieval world were rarely empty. Though seasons changed and weather often turned harsh, travelers pressed forward, merchants with carts, monks carrying messages between abbeys, and pilgrims walking mile after mile with only a staff and bundle. Their journeys were not swift. Roads wound through valleys, forests, and moors, and many stretches were lonely, marked by silence broken only by birdsong or the creak of wooden wheels. For these travelers, rest was essential, and so the practice of hospitality grew deeply into the rhythm of medieval life. Among those who opened their doors were knights who never rode into battle, men whose vows tied them not to conquest but to care. Their halls, standing beside quiet roads or within villages, became places of welcome where weary feet could pause and hunger could be eased. For the knight, hospitality was not an occasional courtesy but a duty rooted in both faith and tradition. The scriptures spoke of welcoming the stranger, and custom expected generosity from those with means. To refuse a traveler was considered dishonorable, especially if that traveler was a pilgrim on the way to a holy site. Thus, the knight, who had no tales of battles to tell, found honor in other ways, by ensuring that his hearth glowed, not only for himself and his household, but also for the wayfarer who might knock upon the gate at dusk. Imagine such a scene. A cold evening settles across the countryside, mist rising from fields where stubble remains after harvest. A figure approaches along the narrow road, cloak damp from drizzle, shoes heavy with mud. The manor ahead shows faint light from its windows, promising warmth. The pilgrim, uncertain but hopeful, lifts the latch of the outer gate. Dogs bark, not fiercely but with notice. and soon a servant leads the traveler inside. There, beneath heavy beams, and beside a roaring fire, the knight offers a place at the bench, bread from the day's baking, and a mug of ale poured from a cask. The traveler's shoulders ease, and the fatigue of the road begins to melt away. Meals for guests were simple but heartfelt. Bread, dark with barley or rye, was set on wooden boards. Bowls of pottage, thick with beans or vegetables, were ladled generously. On occasion, cured meat or fresh fish from a nearby stream might appear, but even the humblest fare was offered with ceremony. A knight might serve the guest himself, or see that the steward did so with care. To eat together was more than nourishment. It was an exchange of trust. The guest accepted not only food, but also safety, and the host, in turn, shared his hall's dignity. Around the hearth, conversation often flowed softly. Pilgrims spoke of shrines they had visited, or of relics they hoped to see. Some carried badges, small pewter tokens stamped with the image of a saint that marked their journeys. Others told of abbeys where bells rang at dawn, of rivers crossed by narrow bridges, or of nights spent in barns when shelter could not be found. The knight listened, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with simple patience, for these stories carried glimpses of a wider world. Though he himself might never travel far, through his guests he learned of distant roads, cities, and customs. Children of the household gathered close during these evenings, drawn by the novelty of strangers' tales. They heard of storms at sea, of mountains where snow never melted, of markets so large they stretched beyond sight. The knight, watching their eyes widen, knew that hospitality gave more than warmth to the traveler, gave wonder to his own household. The hall became not only a place of rest, but also a crossroads of imagination, where the quiet rhythm of estate life touched the broader world. Faith deepened this duty. Pilgrims were often seen as messengers of holiness, their journeys, acts of devotion. To shelter them was to share in their blessing. Many knights, kneeling in their chapels after guests had departed, offered prayers for their safe passage. In doing so, they linked their own static lives with the movement of the pilgrim's path, as if their hospitality became part of the journey itself. A loaf of bread, a mug of ale, a bed of straw, these humble gifts were carried forward, remembered in footsteps long after the guest had gone. Not every traveler was a pilgrim, of course. Some were traders moving goods between towns, their carts loaded with salt, cloth, or tools. Others were messengers bearing letters sealed with wax, or scholars seeking distant libraries. All found similar welcome. The knight who never fought found himself instead negotiating fairness, setting boundaries so that hospitality remained generous yet sustainable. A guest might stay a night, or sometimes two, but rarely more. This balance ensured that kindness could be extended without burdening the household. There was also a sense of protection. Roads could be dangerous, not only from weather, but from thieves or wolves. To enter a knight's hall was to step into safety. The guests slept under a roof guarded by watchful eyes, knowing that within those walls peace held firm. The knight, in turn, took quiet pride in this role of guardian, even if no sword was ever drawn. His strength was measured not by conquest, but by the calm he offered to those who passed through. The architecture of hospitality added to its rhythm. Many halls had benches set along walls, ready to hold more people than the household itself. Straw was spread fresh across floors for sleeping, and cloaks were hung near the fire to dry. In larger estates, guest chambers existed, though simple in furnishing. Even in modest manors, a corner was always found for the stranger. The presence of a pilgrim or traveler was so expected that space was naturally kept for them, as natural as storing grain or fetching water. In the morning, hospitality did not end with sleep. Guests were given bread for the road, perhaps a wedge of cheese, or a flask of ale. Directions were offered, advice on safer paths, warnings of swollen rivers or muddy tracks. Horses, if travelers had them, were fed and watered before departure. When the guest finally stepped out into the cold air, he did so strengthened, carrying with him the memory of warmth and kindness. For the knight, such farewells were part of the rhythm of life. He might never see the traveler again, yet he knew that somewhere along the pilgrim's path, another hall would open its doors, another fire would welcome. In this way, hospitality wove a network across the countryside, binding distant places together not by conquest but by kindness. The knight's hall was a single link in a chain of care that stretched over hills, rivers, and valleys. Even in times when food was scarce, when winter stores ran thin, a portion was still kept for the traveler. This sacrifice carried meaning. To give when it was easy was good, but to give when it was hard was greater. Such gestures became part of the knight's honor, whispered by villagers with respect. He never turned away the weary. They might say, a reputation as enduring as any tale of battle. The knight's children grew up watching this pattern. They learned that strength could mean lifting a heavy beam, but also carrying bread to a stranger. They understood that honor was not only in armor, but also in open hands. These lessons, repeated with every guest, shaped their understanding of knighthood. For some, it inspired future service to the church. For others, it simply grew into habits of kindness that endured through their own lives. When storms struck, hospitality became even more essential. Travelers caught in snow or rain were especially vulnerable. To see a figure struggling along a sodden road and to offer them fire and shelter was not only generous but life-saving. In those moments, the knight's hall was more than a house. It was a beacon, a sanctuary against the harshness of nature. The satisfaction of knowing another human being was spared, suffering carried a quiet weight, a deeper fulfillment than any tale of conquest. Through these practices, hospitality became a form of legacy. Long after a knight's life ended, stories of his generosity lived on in memory. Pilgrims, recalling safe nights along their paths, spoke of him to others. Villagers remembered how his hall never closed its doors. Unlike the chronicles of war, written with dates and victories, these memories passed more softly, but they endured. They spoke not of force but of gentleness, of honor without bloodshed. And so, as evening fell again, and another knock came at the gate, the rhythm continued. The dogs barked, the door opened, and another weary figure stepped into the glow of firelight. The knight rose from his bench, extended his hand, and welcomed the stranger with words both simple and profound. Rest here. In those two words lay centuries of custom, faith, and human connection. Thus, the knights who never went to war found their meaning not on fields of battle but in the simple act of sharing warmth. Their strength was measured not by conquests, but by kindness, their honor preserved not in steel but in bread and ale, in shelter freely given. For the traveler, these halls became anchors of safety across uncertain roads. For the knight, they became a life's work, a steady, enduring testament that peace too has its guardians. In the quiet halls of medieval estates, there often rested objects that carried with them the weight of tradition, duty, and unspoken expectation. Among these, none were as striking as the armor of a knight. Polished, carefully maintained, and always present, it was at once a symbol of readiness and a reminder of paths not taken. For knights who never rode into war, armor became less a tool of combat and more a ritual companion, cared for with steady hands, even if it never felt the press of battle. The presence of steel within a chamber, gleaming faintly in firelight, told a story not of conquest but of endurance, of patience, and of silent guardianship. To own armor was to carry a certain identity. The very word knight conjured images of chainmail, helmets, and swords. Yet in many households, these instruments of protection remained unused, stored in wooden chests or hung carefully on pegs and armories. Still, they were never neglected. The craft of caring for armor was itself a discipline, one that taught attentiveness, humility, and respect. Just as a chapel required maintenance or a field needed tending, so too did the tools of knighthood, even if they never touched the chaos of battle. The process of caring for armor was slow, methodical, and almost meditative. Chainmail, made of thousands of small iron rings linked together, could rust easily if left unattended. To prevent this, knights or their squires rubbed each section with oil, working the liquid into the links with cloth. The sound was soft, metallic, like rain tapping on rooftops. Each ring shone faintly afterward, catching the glow of candles in rhythmic patterns. Helmets, with their rounded domes and narrow eye slits, were polished until reflections appeared faintly on their surfaces. Even swords, rarely drawn, were inspected, sharpened gently, and then sheathed again, resting quietly in scabbards. For many knights who never fought, this ritual became an act of contemplation. As the hand moved steadily across the cold surface of steel, thoughts wandered to duty, family, or faith. The work required patience but not urgency, allowing the mind to settle as the cloth moved in circles. Much like tending a garden or reciting prayers, it offered space for reflection. The gleam of armor became a mirror not only for firelight, but for the knight's own inward stillness. There was also symbolism in the practice. Armor represented readiness, even if the need never came. To polish a breastplate was to acknowledge a responsibility that lingered quietly in the background, like a promise never broken though never called upon. The knight who never rode into combat still carried the identity of protector. His armor was not abandoned but honored, kept whole, as a testament to vows made in youth. The act of care was thus a form of fidelity to the ideal of service, to the memory of tradition, and to the dignity of a role that remained untested yet still valid. Within storage rooms and armories, the presence of armor shaped the atmosphere. Imagine walking into such a space on a winter evening. Torches flicker against stone walls, shadows ripple across wooden beams, and rows of helmets catch the glow like watchful eyes. The scent of oil lingers in the air, mingling with the dry smell of straw and wood. The silence is deep, broken only by the occasional creak of leather straps as they are adjusted, or the soft rasp of a whetstone along steel. Here, the knight stood not as a warrior preparing for battle, but as a steward of objects imbued with meaning. Often, armor was inherited. A suit of chainmail might pass from father to son, each link a reminder of hands that once maintained it. In such cases, armor carried with it not only iron and leather, but memory. To polish a helmet was to see one's reflection alongside the faint traces of those who had worn it before. Even if never tested in combat, the piece remained part of a lineage, connecting generations through the simple ritual of care. For some knights, the armor became less a tool and more an heirloom, valued as much for its symbolism as for its function. In daily life, armor was rarely worn in full. It was heavy, cumbersome, and unnecessary within the safety of estates. Yet certain occasions called for its display. Festivals, ceremonies, or the reception of important visitors often saw the knight don breastplate, helm, or sword knot, for use but for presence. The gleam of polished steel spoke of dignity, of belonging to a tradition that extended beyond the manor walls. Even without battlefield scars, the sight of armor affirmed status and reminded all who saw it that the knight stood ready to fulfill his role. Should need ever arise, there was also artistry in armor. Some suits bore etchings, simple lines along the steel that caught the light in decorative patterns. Others carried emblems of families, engraved or inlaid, marking them as more than mere protection. To care for such details was an act of preservation. A knight who never fought could still honor the craftsmanship by ensuring that designs remained visible, unsmudged by neglect. In this way, armor became both practical and aesthetic, a fusion of utility and beauty, maintained by quiet dedication. The armor's presence also shaped the imagination of the household. Children, passing by the armory, paused to gaze at helmets that seemed to watch them silently. To their young eyes, these objects carried mystery, stories untold. They asked questions of their fathers or uncles. Who wore this before us? What battles might it have seen? Even if the answers were uncertain, the questions themselves linked the younger generation to the broader tradition of knighthood. In this way, armor, though unworn, served as a silent teacher of heritage. In moments of solitude, the knight himself may have wondered about possibilities. What would it feel like to ride into battle, steel gleaming under the sun, the sound of hooves pounding the earth? What would it mean to test the strength of his armor against real blows? Such thoughts came, perhaps, in the quiet of evening, when the hall was dim and the fire low. Yet they remained only thoughts, never acted upon. For these knights, the path of war was not theirs to take. Their armor stood as a reminder of that divergence, at once a presence and an absence, a role acknowledged but unfulfilled. Yet this unfulfillment was not failure. On the contrary, it shaped a different kind of honor. The armor's silence spoke of restraint, of lives guided by peace rather than violence. To polish steel that would never clash in combat was to declare that dignity did not depend on bloodshed. The knight's worth lay not in scars but in constancy, in care for land, people, and tradition. In this light, armor became less an instrument of battle and more a symbol of peace maintained through readiness. Visitors to such halls noticed the gleaming suits resting in corners or displayed in chambers. To them, the sight was reassuring. Even without the sound of war drums, the presence of armor suggested stability, order, and protection. Guests knew that the knight upheld the symbols of his role, even if its violent aspect remained unused. Thus, armor was as much about perception as about function. It reassured communities that knighthood still lived, even in times when swords stayed sheathed. The cycle of care repeated endlessly. Week after week, month after month, armor was lifted from racks, wiped, oiled, and set back again. The process never grew hurried, for haste invited neglect. Instead, the knight or his attendants approached the task with steady rhythm, as predictable as the tolling of chapel bells or the changing of seasons. Each motion affirmed continuity, each polished link a quiet promise that tradition endured. At times, the armor seemed almost alive. Firelight danced across its surfaces, giving the impression of movement, as though the suit longed to rise and walk. In the stillness of storage rooms, the gleam of helmets appeared like watchful eyes, guardians in silence. For the knight, this sensation deepened the sense of companionship. Armor became not an unused possession but a presence within the household, a constant reminder of duty, heritage, and honor. And so, the craft of armor unworn revealed itself not in combat but in care. To polish steel, to oil chainmail, to sharpen blades that would never strike, these were acts of quiet devotion. They spoke of readiness without violence, dignity without conquest, identity without blood. For the knights who never fought, armor was not a contradiction but a companion, reflecting firelight in endless patience, waiting not for war but for the simple honor of being kept whole. Thus, in the long evenings of the manor, while wind pressed against shutters and families gathered around the hearth, somewhere nearby the armor gleamed softly, untouched, yet never forgotten. Its silence was not emptiness but fullness of another kind of fullness of tradition, care, and meaning carried gently across generations. The closing of any life, whether that of a king or of a knight who never rode into war, is marked not by a single deed but by the accumulation of countless days. For those knights who lived far from the battlefield, whose swords remained polished but unbloodied, the sum of their years created a legacy quieter than the clamor of conquest, yet no less enduring. When we look back on them, we do not find their names carved in epic chronicles of battles won or enemies slain. Instead, we find traces of them in the tended fields that still bore fruit long after they were gone, in the chapels whose bells rang steadily because someone had cared for the stones, and in the families who remembered evenings of peace rather than nights of terror. Their legacy did not shout. It lingered like the glow of lanterns in windows, a steady, gentle light that outlasted storms. These knights lived within rhythms, shaped by care rather than conflict. To walk through their estates was to see order not imposed by force but by attention. Fences were mended not to keep out marauding armies but to protect crops from wandering animals. Wells were kept clean so that water remained safe for generations. Orchards spread their branches across green slopes because someone, years before, had planted saplings with a mind not to glory but to continuity. In every act of stewardship, these knights invested in a future they might never see, trusting that the fruit of their patience would feed children yet unborn. Such devotion, though humble, built a foundation upon which entire communities could rest. In memory, they were less warriors and more guardians of peace. Villagers knew that behind the walls of the manor, a knight lived who might own armor, who might carry a sword, but whose greatest weapon was fairness. Disputes were settled not with threats, but with careful words spoken at wooden tables. Market days unfolded without fear, because the knight's presence ensured that justice, not greed, guided exchanges. Pilgrims traveling through lands found open gates rather than barred ones, and bread waiting on long tables rather than suspicion. These acts did not inspire bards to sing, yet in their quiet persistence they created stability that endured longer than the memory of most victories. The legacy of such knights was written into the lives of those around them. Children raised within their halls learned lessons of patience, courtesy, and discipline without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Pages who studied under them discovered that service could mean carrying letters, repairing fences, or learning to read scripture. And that knighthood was not solely a matter of combat but of character. Families thrived under roofs that did not tremble with war. Villages prospered because peace allowed grain to grow uninterrupted. The invisible shield these knights provided was not forged from iron but from reliability, kindness, and attentiveness. Their protection was so effective that it often went unnoticed, like air that sustains without drawing attention to itself. When death eventually came, it arrived not with trumpets but with silence. A knight who had never fought might be buried in a small chapel, the stone floor cooled beneath the coffin, the bells tolling gently above. His armor, perhaps, was laid beside him, gleaming not with dents of combat, but with the polish of years of care. The villagers who gathered remembered not victories but the seasons they had lived in peace under his watch. The stories they passed down spoke of harvest festivals, of music in the hall, of gardens that provided remedies in times of sickness. These memories, though modest, were no less sacred than tales of battle. For what greater gift can one leave than the memory of safety? Generations later, chroniclers rarely recorded their names. History tends to favor kings, conquerors, and warriors whose deeds shaped borders and toppled thrones. Yet, in the shadows of those louder lives, the legacy of these quiet nights remained. It survived in oral tales, in family traditions, in the survival of villages that might otherwise have been abandoned. A grandchild ploughing fields could trace his stability back to the careful governance of a knight who never rode to war. A chapel still ringing its bell owed its endurance to one who tended stones and wood with patient devotion. Though absent from official records, their impact lingered in every corner where life continued undisturbed. To honor them is to broaden our vision of knighthood itself. Too often, the word conjures only images of lances lowered, banners flying, and swords clashing. Yet knighthood, at its heart, was also about service, about carrying responsibility with dignity. These knights embodied that deeper truth. By living lives of stewardship and restraint, they revealed another face of honor, not the kind won in a moment of triumph, but the kind cultivated through decades of patience. Their strength lay not in conquest but in constancy. They taught, through their example, that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the active presence of care. Their quiet legacy endures like lanterns glowing faintly in memory. Imagine walking through a village at twilight, centuries after such a night has passed. The cottages stand firm, smoke rises from chimneys, and laughter drifts through windows. Somewhere in the soil beneath those fields are the traces of his footsteps. The careful furrows he ensured were plowed, the orchards he planted. Somewhere, in the habits of courtesy and fairness practiced by villagers, are echoes of his judgments, his gentle discipline. Though the knight himself is gone, his influence burns on, soft yet steady, like a lantern guiding travelers along a darkened road. Even today, when we read of battles and kings, there is value in pausing to remember the quieter figures. There is a legacy of possibility, the reminder that honor does not have to be proven in war, that dignity is not dependent on bloodshed, and that strength can reside in gentleness. In every age, there are those who preserve peace rather than disturb it, who build rather than destroy, who shine in ways history's spotlight rarely acknowledges. To remember these knights is to remember that history is not only made on battlefields but also in fields of barley, in chapels where bells ring at dusk, and in homes where families gather around a fire without fear. Thus the story of these knights closes not with a roar but with a hush, not with a clash of swords but with the soft tolling of chapel bells across quiet valleys. Their lives remind us that legacy is not measured solely by fame, but by the quality of what is left behind. Estates tended well, families raised in peace, villages that flourished under watchful care, these were their victories. And though their names may not echo in the annals of war, their influence whispers still, steady as lanterns in the night, guiding us to consider a different kind of strength, a different kind of knighthood, one that endures not through conquest, but through care. As the lantern light fades once more in our quiet medieval town, we find ourselves at the end of this gentle journey. The streets are hushed, their stones cool beneath the night air, and the river that winds through the valley whispers softly. Against its banks, the town has long since fallen asleep, shutters closed, fires dimmed to embers, and yet the memory of the nights we have visited remains, like a faint glow on the horizon. These were not warriors of renown, not champions carved into statues or sung about in grand halls. Instead, they were keepers of ordinary time knights who never went to war. We often imagine knighthood as a path of thunderous hooves, banners unfurled, and swords raised against the sky. Yet history also tells us of the men who carried the same titles and bore the same arms, but whose lives unfolded far from the battlefield. They lived among chapels and gardens, in halls filled with laughter and quiet music, in stables where horses nickered softly in the straw. Their legacy was not one of conquest, but of patience and stewardship. They preserved what might otherwise have been lost in times of unrest, harvests, homes, and the unbroken rhythm of daily life. Imagine again the knight at his hearth, resting in the glow of firelight. His armor is polished, though never dented in combat. His sword rests on a rack, sharp but unstained. The hall is filled, not with warriors, but with family, servants, and guests. A minstrel plucks gently at a lute, filling the air with a melody that seems to float like smoke toward the rafters. The knight listens, not as a conqueror reliving tales of glory, but as a man content with the simple beauty of sound. His strength is measured not in battlefields crossed, but in the steadiness of his gaze, the calm of his presence, the quiet example he sets for those around him. In another place, a different knight tends to his gardens. The morning air is fresh, heavy with the scent of rosemary and sage. Bees hum among the blossoms, their wings catching the sunlight. He stoops to gather herbs, hands steady, movements These small leaves, once dried, will ease the aches of his household, bringing relief to fever and rest to restless sleep. His service lies not in destruction, but in healing. And though his garden will never be recorded in chronicles of war, it is as much a legacy as any battlefield won, for it nurtured life in its most fragile forms. Some knights found their meaning in chapels, where bells tolled softly across the hills. They stood in silence, cloaked in devotion, their lives ordered by prayer and reflection. No drumbeat called them to charge, but the rhythm of the hours, matins, lauds, vespers, shaped their existence. Theirs was not a life of shouting commands, but of whispering psalms. Their courage was quieter, found in the discipline of humility, in the strength to remain rather than to conquer. In their watchfulness, they became unseen guardians of peace, their presence a shield of calm for those who lived nearby. And there were others still, men who oversaw markets, who counted coins, who signed agreements by candlelight. Their role was to ensure fairness, to settle disputes before they grew into strife, to see that trade moved smoothly from village to village. They carried authority not through force of arms, but through the trust of their people. These knights taught us that justice is not always a matter of sword and shield, but often of steady words and thoughtful decisions. Their armor, though unworn in battle, still gleamed. It was tended like an heirloom, polished with care, stored with reverence. It represented readiness, yes, but also possibility on unchosen path, a symbol of what might have been but never was. In its stillness, the armor became more than protection. It became a reminder that strength lies not only in action, but sometimes in restraint. To leave the sword sheathed is, in its way, an act of courage. As centuries passed, many of these knights faded into obscurity. Their names are missing from chronicles, absent from the carved stones of memorials. Yet their legacy lingers in quieter ways, in the villages that endured without devastation, in the chapels that stood unbroken, in the families who thrived beneath their care. Theirs is a history not of spectacle, but of survival, of lives preserved, of peace held together like a fragile thread. Without them, the great stories of kings and kingdoms might not have been possible at all. For it is in peaceful spaces that culture, learning, and memory take root. Think of the manuscripts copied in monasteries, the songs carried across fields, the tools fashioned by village craftsmen. All of these required time and quiet conditions that knights of peace helped to safeguard. Their work may have been invisible, but it was foundational. For every great battle fought, there were countless unseen acts of preservation, fields harvested, fires tended, children raised, communities protected. The knights, who never went to war, were stewards of that hidden history. And so, as we let this story settle into silence, we return once more to the image of the town at night. The river continues its journey, steady and calm. The lanterns flicker, their light falling across stone and wood. In a nearby chapel, a bell sounds, its note carrying far into the stillness. A knight walks slowly through the courtyard of his manor, the air cool against his face, the stars beginning to brighten overhead. He pauses, listens to the sound of his horses shifting in the stable, and feels the weight of another day gently conclude. There is no battle to recall, no wound to tend, no victory to celebrate. Instead, there is the quiet satisfaction of life lived steadily, faithfully, and in peace. Perhaps In remembering these nights, we are invited to reflect upon our own lives. Great victories are rare, but small acts of patience and care are daily. We may never march into history's chronicles, yet our kindness, our steadiness, our willingness to protect what is good and simple can carry its own form of legacy. The knights who never went to war remind us that strength can be quiet, and that peace, once held, is as noble a prize as any battlefield triumph. So let the story close gently, like the closing of a wooden door, like the fading of candlelight after prayer. The town is asleep, the river keeps its steady song, and the nights of peace remain in memory, lanterns of another age, glowing softly against the dark. Rest now, with their quiet company.